Welcome, and thank you for being here. Tonight we're going to move slowly through one of the most quietly heartbreaking questions that the story of Spider-Man has ever asked. Not why he fights, not who his enemies are, not how many times he has saved the city or the world or the people he loves, but something softer and more personal than any of that. Tonight we're asking why happiness, for Peter Parker, has always seemed to arrive like a visitor who never quite stays. Why joy, when it comes to him, comes already wearing the expression of something about to leave. This is not a story about battles or villains or the mechanics of heroism. It is a story about a person, a very particular and very human person, and the quiet architecture of belief that was built inside him long before any spider ever crossed his path. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and let the story come to you gently. There is nothing here that needs to be chased or held on to. Simply listen and let yourself rest. There is a house on Ingram Street in the borough of Queens, New York, that does not appear in most of the histories written about Spider-Man. It is not a landmark. It does not have a plaque. The tourists who make their way through the city in search of the places that shaped Marvel's most beloved hero tend to look upward, toward the bridges and the skyline and the tall buildings whose sides a wall-crawling teenager once learned to climb. They do not tend to stop on a quiet residential street lined with trees and modest homes and look at a small, carefully maintained house with flowers in the front garden and a workshop in the basement and a particular quality of warm amber light coming through the kitchen window in the early evening hours. But if you want to understand why Peter Parker became who he became, and more specifically why happiness seemed to move through his life, the way light moves through water, present, visible, bending in beautiful ways but never quite something you can hold in your hand, then this is exactly where the story has to begin. Not with the spider, not with the radioactive bite, not with the costume or the web shooters or the first terrifying discovery that he could stick to walls, with the house, with the people inside it, with the particular shape of the love that was waiting for him there, and with the particular shape of the absence that had arrived before he was old enough to understand what absence meant. Peter Benjamin Parker came into the world already defined by loss. His parents, Richard and Mary Parker, both agents working in service of their country, died when Peter was very young enough that he carried no clear memories of them, only the faint impressionistic residue that the very early years sometimes leave behind. A sense of warmth, perhaps, the suggestion of a voice, the feeling of being held by someone whose face he could no longer quite reconstruct. They were taken from him before he had the language to grieve them, which meant that his grief had nowhere to go and nothing to attach itself to, and so it settled into him instead, becoming part of the background radiation of his emotional life in a way that he would not begin to understand until he was much older. To lose your parents before you can remember them is a particular kind of loss. It does not arrive as a wound so much as a permanent awareness of a space that should be filled, a presence that should exist but doesn't, a question that the world cannot quite answer no matter how many kind people surround you. The people who surrounded Peter were, by any measure, extraordinary in their goodness. Benjamin Parker, his father's older brother, was not a man of wealth or ambition, or particular prominence in the wider world. He worked various jobs throughout his life: repair work, security, the kind of steady, unglamorous labour that holds neighbourhoods together without ever making headlines. He was a man of patience, of quiet humour, of a moral seriousness that expressed itself not through lectures or pronouncements, but through the simple consistency of his choices. He helped neighbours who couldn't afford to pay him. He treated everyone he encountered with the same basic respect regardless of their circumstances. He told terrible jokes at the dinner table and laughed at them himself when no one else did. He called Peter Tiger, an affectionate, slightly absurd nickname that said everything about how he saw his nephew, as someone with more in him than the world had yet discovered, someone worth believing in. Benjamin Parker was not Spider-Man's uncle in any mythological sense. He was simply a good man who loved a child who needed to be loved, and who did that loving with a consistency and a generosity that shaped the child's understanding of what human beings owed each other more profoundly than any formal moral education could have. May Parker, his wife, was a woman whose worrying was itself a form of love. She worried about Peter's health, his social life, his academic performance, his nutrition, his happiness, his future, the weather when he went outside without a coat, the quality of sleep he was getting, and roughly 11,000 other variables that she monitored with the dedication of someone who had decided that caring for this boy was the work her life was for. She was not a woman of great physical robustness. Her health was always somewhat fragile, something that would become more significant as Peter's story unfolded. But she possessed a moral and emotional resilience that expressed itself in the daily act of making a home that felt safe, that felt warm, that felt like a place the world's harshness could not quite reach. Her garden bloomed every spring with the same careful attention she gave to everything she loved. Her kitchen produced the kinds of meals that exist primarily as memory rather than nutrition, the taste of belonging, the flavour of being known. And Peter, growing up in the middle of all this warmth, was both nourished by it and quietly haunted by its edges. He knew he was loved. He felt it daily in ways that many children do not. But he also knew, at some level beneath language, that the love surrounding him was a compensatory love, a love that had arranged itself to fill a shape that had been emptied by someone else's death. Ben and May were not his parents. They had chosen to be, and the choosing was perhaps even more beautiful than biology would have been. But the original loss remained, embedded in the family's story like a foundation stone that no one discussed, because discussing it would mean acknowledging that the house stood on ground that had once been broken. Peter absorbed this knowledge not as a source of resentment. He never felt anything so sharp as resentment toward his aunt and uncle, who were nothing but generous and devoted, but as a quiet background understanding that love, however real and however freely given, existed in relationship to loss, and that the two things were not separable. At Midtown High School, Peter existed in the particular social purgatory reserved for teenagers whose intelligence is perceived as a social liability rather than an asset. He was the boy teachers called on when they wanted the right answer, and classmates avoided when they wanted to have fun. Flash Thompson. Tall and confident and surrounded at all times by the social approval that Peter could not seem to generate no matter how hard his mind worked, made a project of Peter's humiliation with the casual cruelty of someone who had never been required to develop empathy because the world had always been arranged in his favour. The bullying was not vicious in the way that violence is vicious. It was more diffuse than that, more social, the kind of daily low-level dismissal that doesn't leave visible marks but accumulates over time into a comprehensive portrait of worthlessness that a sensitive and intelligent boy carries forward long after the specific incidents have been forgotten. What is important to understand about Peter's experience at Midtown High is not simply that he was lonely. Many teenagers are lonely, and most of them recover without it fundamentally altering their understanding of what they deserve from life. What is important is the specific texture of his loneliness, the way it combined with his awareness of his parents' absence, and the compensatory nature of his family's love to create a particular emotional conclusion, that he was someone the world had to be persuaded to notice. Someone who had to earn the right to matter, someone for whom belonging was always conditional and always requiring continuous justification. This was not a conclusion he could have articulated at 15. It lived below the level of words, in the register of assumption rather than thought. But it was there, already forming, already quietly shaping the way he would respond to every gift and every tragedy that the years ahead had prepared for him. The house on Ingram Street held all of this with the patience that houses have when they have absorbed the full range of a family's emotional life. The photos on every surface showing Peter at various ages, always with that slightly serious expression. May's flowers in the front garden. Ben's unfinished projects in the basement. The kitchen light, warm and amber in the evening. It was a house that said, "You are known here, you are safe here, you belong here." And Peter, who needed to hear that more than most, heard it every day, and was grateful for it, and was also, somewhere in the unexamined depths of himself, waiting, though he could not have said so, could not have named the waiting or explained its direction, for the moment when all this warmth would be taken from him, not because he was a pessimist or a frightened child, but because some part of him had already learned, from the very beginning of his life, that this was how things went, that love arrived and then was lost, that belonging was always temporary, that happiness in the end was something that happened to other people for longer. He was 15 years old when the spider bit him. He was already, in all the ways that would matter most, someone who had been primed not for triumph, but for sacrifice. The powers that came to him changed what he could do. They did not change what he believed he deserved. And it is that belief, quiet, persistent, never quite spoken aloud, that this story is really about. The spider bite, when people talk about it, tends to be described in the language of destiny, a fateful encounter, a transformative moment, the inciting event of a legend. And there is truth in that framing as far as it goes. But it misses something important about what actually happened on that Tuesday afternoon in November of 1962, which is that the person it happened to was a 15-year-old boy who was only half paying attention, who had homework to finish and no particular reason to believe that anything unusual was about to occur, and who experienced the whole thing not as the beginning of a legend but as a small, sharp pain on the back of his right hand that he noticed and then tried to ignore because he didn't want to cause a disruption during the educational presentation. The field trip to the science demonstration at the local university was the kind of event that appears on school calendars and gets attended with the dutiful enthusiasm of teenagers who would rather be almost anywhere else. Peter Parker was an exception to this general indifference. Science was his native territory, the place where his mind moved most freely and most happily, and a demonstration involving radioactive research represented exactly the kind of thing he could lose himself in while the social dynamics of his peer group continued without requiring his participation. He sat in the middle of the lecture hall and listened with genuine attention as the presenter explained the peaceful applications of atomic energy, the ways that controlled radiation could be directed toward problems of medicine and material science and human benefit. Around him, his classmates performed varying degrees of interested engagement, most of them more focused on whispering to each other than on the content being delivered from the front of the room. The spider that would change everything was, at that moment, so small as to be nearly invisible, no larger than a pencil eraser, enclosed in a glass container as part of the demonstration of how radioactive exposure affected living tissue, its body carrying within it the altered genetic material that weeks of carefully controlled radiation had produced. It was not supposed to escape its enclosure. The enclosure was not supposed to be improperly secured. Many of the most consequential moments in human history have been preceded by exactly this kind of small, unremarkable failure of protocol, the kind that nobody notices until afterward, when the chain of causation becomes visible in retrospect, and everyone can see precisely where things departed from the intended plan. The spider descended on a thread of silk that caught the light in the lecture hall and was noticed by no one. It moved with the quiet purposefulness that spiders have always possessed, navigating the air between the demonstration table and the rows of seated students with an efficiency that had nothing to do with intention and everything to do with the particular genius of its biology. It landed on the back of Peter's right hand while he was examining his own palm, following the lines there with the distracted curiosity of a mind that was always looking for patterns, always finding things to think about in the ordinary surfaces of the world. The pain was immediate and surprisingly intense, far beyond what a spider bite of that size should have been able to produce, carrying within it a heat that spread up his hand and into his forearm with a speed that suggested something more than venom, something that was already beginning the work of rewriting the instructions his cells had been following since before he was born. He looked down and saw the spider glowing faintly with the pale luminescence that the radiation had given it, and then he brushed it away and watched it fall, curling as it landed. Spent from the effort of delivering everything it carried, he sat very still for a moment. He did not raise his hand. He did not say anything to the students sitting on either side of him. He simply pressed his other hand over the bite and waited for the heat to subside, which it did not do, and tried to concentrate on the rest of the presentation, which he could not quite manage, and told himself that he was probably fine, which he was not, though the ways in which he was not fine were going to take some time to become apparent. The walk home from school that afternoon was one of the stranger experiences of Peter's life up to that point, which was saying something for a boy who had grown up with the particular strangeness of his circumstances. The world seemed to have been adjusted while he wasn't looking, turned up slightly in every register, made a little louder and a little brighter and a little more textured than it had been that morning. Colours were more vivid in a way he couldn't quite account for. Sounds arrived with a clarity and a directionality that allowed him to locate their sources with unsettling precision. The sensation of his clothes against his skin had become something he was acutely aware of, as though nerve endings that had previously operated somewhere below consciousness had been brought to the surface and made newly sensitive. He stopped twice on the way home, leaning against a lamppost with his eyes closed, trying to stabilize the dizziness that came in waves, trying to understand whether he was coming down with something ordinary or whether something else entirely was happening to him. Aunt May took one look at his face when he came through the door and immediately began the rituals of concern that she had developed over years of caring for a child who tried not to worry her. Aspirin, soup, a hand against his forehead, the gentle suggestion that he go upstairs and rest, the implicit reassurance that everything was going to be fine because she was going to make sure of it. Peter accepted all of this with the gratitude of someone who is genuinely unwell and has just arrived somewhere safe, and went up to his room and lay down on his bed and tried to sleep while his body conducted whatever transformation it had decided to conduct without consulting him. The dreams that came that night were unlike anything he had experienced before. They were not frightening exactly, but they were deeply disorienting, full of movement and perspective and a physical vocabulary that had no reference point in his waking life. He dreamed of climbing without effort, of sensing the world around him as a continuous field of information rather than a sequence of separate perceptions, of strength that expressed itself not as violence, but as ease, as the absence of resistance, as the sudden irrelevance of all the physical limitations that had previously defined the boundaries of what was possible. He dreamed of being at the center of something larger than himself, connected to it through threads that he could feel but not see, and the feeling was not frightening but was instead something close to peace. He woke in the morning not remembering the dreams clearly but carrying their residue in his body, like the memory of music heard from another room. The first morning of Peter Parker's transformed life began with the discovery that he no longer needed his glasses. He reached for them from the habit of years and then realized that the room was perfectly clear without them, that every detail of every surface was visible to him, with a precision that his corrected vision had never quite achieved. He held the glasses in his hand for a long moment, looking at them, and then set them down on the nightstand with the careful deliberateness of someone who is not quite sure how to respond to a miracle. Then he sat up in bed and accidentally put his hand through the wooden headboard. The strength was the most immediately dramatic of the changes, because it was the most immediately visible, his enhanced muscles producing force that his ordinary furniture was not designed to withstand, requiring him to develop in the space of a single morning an entirely new relationship with the physical world around him, learning how lightly to touch things, how carefully to move, how to calibrate the pressure of his grip to the fragility of the object he was holding. He spent the morning hours in his bedroom while Aunt May assumed he was sleeping, testing the edges of what he had become with the methodical curiosity of someone who is also a scientist, and cannot simply experience a phenomenon without wanting to understand it. He could lift his desk with one hand. He could stick to the ceiling. He could feel, through some sense that had no name yet, the approach of his aunt's footsteps on the stairs before he heard them. This last ability, the one he would eventually call his spider sense, was in some ways the most remarkable and the most difficult to process, because it was not quite like any other sense he possessed. It did not function through a specific organ or register in a specific part of his awareness. It was more like a change in the texture of his consciousness, an additional layer of information about the world that arrived not as sight or sound or touch, but as a kind of knowing, immediate and pre-verbal, that certain things were happening or about to happen in the space around him. He knew, without turning around, that the bird that landed on his windowsill was small and agitated and about to take flight again. He knew, before she knocked, that Aunt May was at his door. He knew, in a way he could not have explained, the precise layout of his room in 3 dimensions, the location of every object within it, the movements of air that told him something about the weather outside. What he did not know, lying on his bed in the late morning light of that first strange day, was what any of this was for. He was 15 years old, and he had just become something that had never existed before, and the feeling this produced was not immediately heroic. It was bewildering and a little frightening, and shot through with a kind of excitement that he was not entirely comfortable with, because it seemed too large for the circumstances, too nakedly pleasurable for something he hadn't asked for and didn't yet understand. The scientific part of his mind was already constructing hypotheses about the mechanism of his transformation, the ways that the spider's altered DNA might have interacted with his own genetic material. the specific pathways by which enhanced strength and adhesion and sensory acuity might be expressed at the cellular level. The teenage part of his mind was thinking, with the uncomplicated joy of someone who has spent 15 years being overlooked and dismissed, that Flash Thompson was not going to believe this. The following days brought gradual adaptation and expanding experimentation and the beginning of a question that Peter was not yet equipped to answer. He returned to school with his glasses in his pocket as a prop, using them when he remembered and forgetting them when he didn't, navigating the social landscape of Midtown High with a new and slightly dangerous ease, his reflexes catching things before they fell. His strength expressing itself in inadvertent moments that he had to quickly contextualize as luck or coincidence, his spider sense giving him information about his environment that he had to pretend not to have. When Flash shoved him into a locker in the hallway and Peter's hand closed around Flash's wrist with a gentleness that nonetheless sent the larger boy stumbling backwards several feet, the look on Flash's face was something Peter had never seen directed at him before. Not fear exactly, but its close neighbour, uncertainty. The sudden revision of an assumption that had previously seemed so stable as to not require examination. Peter did not pursue the advantage. He stood very still and said nothing and let Flash recover and walk away, and he felt, in the aftermath of that moment, something complicated that he was not quite ready to name. It was not triumph, though there was an element of that. It was more like the awareness that a door had opened, and that what lay on the other side of it was not simply a different version of his high school experience, but something much larger and much less manageable than that. Something that was going to require him to make choices that he had not yet thought through, about what kind of person he wanted to be, and what he was willing to use his new capacities for, and who he imagined himself to be in the private space where no one else's expectations could reach him. The advertisement for the wrestling match appeared on a notice board near the school gymnasium, and Peter's response to it was entirely human and entirely understandable and requires no apology. $100 for staying in the ring 3 minutes with a professional wrestler was a significant sum to a boy from a household where money was always slightly scarce, where the microscope he wanted lived in a catalogue rather than on his desk, where Aunt May occasionally looked at bills with an expression she quickly replaced with cheerfulness when she noticed Peter watching her. The money was real, and the opportunity was obvious, and the chance to test his abilities in a controlled environment against an opponent who was supposed to be formidable appealed to the scientist in him who wanted data points. He was not thinking about heroism. He was thinking about the microscope and about proving something to himself in a space where the outcome would be unambiguous. The wrestling arena was everything that Ingram Street was not. Loud and smoky and indifferent to the feelings of anyone present, smelling of beer and ambition and the particular collective energy of people gathered to watch someone get hurt. Peter's hastily assembled costume, a red shirt with a web pattern drawn on it and a crude mask that covered most of his face, was not the outfit of a hero. It was the outfit of a teenager who needed to hide his identity and had 40 minutes and whatever was in his bedroom to work with. He signed up under the name Spider-Man almost as an afterthought, the first name that occurred to him that connected to what he had become, and walked out into the ring to the sound of the crowd's laughter, which was the sound he was most accustomed to hearing in response to his presence, and which no longer had quite the power over him that it once had. What happened in that ring over the following 3 minutes was the first real evidence, visible to anyone who cared to look, that Peter Parker had become something genuinely new. He did not simply survive against Crusher Hogan. He moved in ways that a human body was not supposed to be able to move, climbing the ropes and the ring posts, anticipating the larger man's attacks before they landed, applying his enhanced strength with a precision that looked effortless, because it was effortless, because everything that had once required effort now simply required the decision to act. The crowd, which had been laughing, went quiet and then went loud again in a completely different register, the laughter replaced by something closer to awe, and Peter stood in the centre of the ring with Crusher Hogan on his back and the prize money being counted out for him, and felt, for perhaps the first time in his life, that the world was paying attention to him in a way that did not require him to make himself smaller or smarter or more invisible. The television producer found him in the dressing room afterward and made an offer that seemed, to a 15-year-old boy who had spent his entire life being ignored by the people who assigned value to things, almost impossibly good. Appearances on a variety show, payment for demonstrations of his abilities, the prospect of a career built on being exactly what he was, remarkable, powerful, capable of things that no one else could do. He said yes. Of course he said yes. The boy who had been invisible for 15 years had just been offered visibility, and the offer came with money, and the money would help Aunt May, and the abilities that made it all possible were his, genuinely his, and if he wanted to use them to make his life better, rather than to perform some abstract notion of duty he had not yet been asked to perform, then there was nothing wrong with that. There was nothing wrong with wanting to be seen. There was nothing wrong with wanting the world to register your existence as something worth registering. He walked out of the television studio on the evening of his first appearance, counting money, and feeling something that he would only be able to identify in retrospect, looking back from the distance of everything that came after. He was feeling happiness. Simple, uncomplicated, unearned happiness. The kind that does not yet know what it is going to cost. He had it for a few more days, this feeling. He carried it home on the subway and into the house on Ingram Street and sat with it at the dinner table, and took it upstairs with him when he went to bed. It was real. It was his. The universe had not yet presented the invoice. The invoice arrived on a Thursday evening in late November, and it arrived in the form of a telephone ringing in the hallway downstairs, while Peter was in his room working on homework and thinking about his next television appearance, and existing, as he had been existing for the past several days, inside the warm and unfamiliar feeling of being someone the world had decided to pay attention to. He heard Aunt May answer the phone. He heard her voice change. He did not yet know what the change meant, but something in him, the spider sense perhaps, or something older and more fundamental than that, some animal awareness that had been part of human beings long before radioactive spiders existed, registered the shift in her tone as significant before his conscious mind had processed a single word. He came to the top of the stairs and stood there listening, and the police officer's voice drifted up to him in fragments, professional and careful, and shaped by the particular gentleness that people in that profession develop for the delivery of news that cannot be made gentle, and the fragments assembled themselves into a picture that Peter's mind refused for a long moment to accept. Ben, the warehouse where he worked a night security shift, a burglar, a gun. The hospital and the ambulance, and the specific quality of the officer's silence after he said the word hospital, that communicated everything the word itself was trying to leave open. The drive to the hospital exists in Peter's memory, and in the memory of anyone who has ever made that particular drive, as a sequence of images rather than a continuous experience. Streetlights sliding past, Aunt May's hands clasped together in her lap, the sound of the car's engine, the way the city continued to exist around them in complete indifference to what was happening inside that moving vehicle. Peter sat in the back seat and looked out the window, and felt the spider sense doing something it had no framework for, reaching out into the immediate future and finding nothing it could interpret, no physical threat to locate or quantify, just an enormity that was not the kind of danger it had been designed to detect. He was 15 years old. He had been happy 3 days ago. He was beginning to understand, in the wordless register where the most important understandings live, that the happiness and what was happening now were not unrelated. The doctor's words in the hospital waiting room were brief and careful and final. Uncle Ben had not survived. The injury had been too severe, the damage too immediate, and no amount of medical skill or speed of response had been sufficient to prevent the outcome that the bullet had made almost inevitable from the moment it was fired. Aunt May made a sound that Peter had never heard from her before and would never forget, a sound that came from a place in her that was below the reach of the composed and caring woman she presented to the world every day, a sound that was purely animal and purely grief. Peter stood beside her and put his arms around her, and felt the weight of her leaning into him, and held on, and understood that something had ended. The grief that followed was real and consuming and deserves to be honoured for exactly what it was before anything else about that night is discussed. Benjamin Parker was the man who had raised Peter Parker. He was the person who had called him Tiger and believed in his potential and laughed at his own terrible jokes and fixed things for the neighbours, and came to check on him when he was sick with the quiet, undemonstrative care of someone who expressed love primarily through presence and consistency rather than through declaration. He was not a complicated man in the way that novelists mean when they use that word approvingly. He was good in the straightforward and increasingly rare sense of simply doing the right thing, consistently, without requiring recognition for it, because he believed that this was what people were for. To lose him at 15, without warning, on an ordinary Thursday in November, was devastating in the way that only the loss of someone genuinely irreplaceable can be devastating. Not because no one else would ever love Peter, but because no one else would ever be Ben. And Ben was a specific and singular presence, whose absence left a specific and singular hole. But grief, in Peter's case, did not remain pure. It could not. Because grief, to transform into the thing that would define the rest of his life, required one more piece of information, and that information was waiting for him at the warehouse on the waterfront where the burglar had gone to hide after he ran. Peter left the hospital with the explanation that he needed air. He found a bathroom and changed into his Spider-Man costume in a stall, and the act of pulling the mask over his face was not, in that moment, the act of becoming a hero. It was the act of becoming something that could move through the night without being identified, something that could find the person responsible for what had happened and make that person answer for it, something that the raw and directionless energy of his grief and rage could inhabit and use. He was not thinking about justice in any abstract sense. He was 15 years old and his uncle was dead and someone had done that, and his spider sense could find that someone, and the strength in his hands was capable of things that he did not yet allow himself to fully imagine. Finding the burglar was not difficult. The police had established a perimeter around the warehouse district and were conducting their search with the methodical thoroughness of people working within procedural constraints. But Peter operated outside those constraints, moving through the shadows above the street level, following a trail of disturbance that his enhanced senses could read, the way a practiced tracker reads disturbed earth and broken branches. The waterfront warehouse was dark and silent from the outside, but his spider sense registered the presence of someone inside it, moving carefully, trying to be still. He went in through a high window and dropped silently to the floor, and found the burglar crouched behind a stack of old crates, counting the money he had stolen by the light of a small flashlight, and the sight of him, ordinary, small, unremarkable, not a monster or a creature of supernatural malevolence, but simply a man doing a venal and thoughtless thing with complete indifference to the life it had cost, produced in Peter a rage so complete and so physical that it expressed itself not as sound or movement but as a moment of absolute stillness, the eye of something that could have become a storm. He brought the man down with efficiency. He webbed him to the wall with the web shooters he had built in his bedroom from the chemistry knowledge that had always been his greatest asset, the ones he had designed for the wrestling match and the television appearances, never imagining a use for them like this one. The man struggled and found that he could not move and turned toward Peter with the flashlight still in his hand, and the light fell on his face, and Peter saw who he was. There are moments in a life that divide everything into before and after, and this was Peter Parker's. The face of the man webbed to the warehouse wall was the face of the man he had let walk past him in the corridor of the television studio several days earlier, the man the security guard had called out to him to stop, the thief who had just robbed the business office, the person Peter had watched escape into the elevator, while he told himself it was not his job, it was not his problem, he was an entertainer, not a policeman, and he had his own concerns and his own future to think about. The face was unmistakable. Peter had looked directly at it in the studio corridor. He was looking directly at it now. The understanding that assembled itself in Peter's mind in that moment did not arrive as a thought so much as a physical sensation, a cold and total clarity that moved through him from the top of his head to the soles of his feet and left everything it touched permanently changed. The connection was absolute and it was irrefutable, and it admitted of no interpretation other than the one that was already completing itself in his awareness before he had consciously begun to form it. If he had stopped this man at the television studio, Ben Parker would be alive. The chain of causation ran without a single break from Peter's choice in that corridor, to the gun in that warehouse, to the hospital waiting room where Aunt May was sitting right now, with her hands clasped in her lap and her world reduced to rubble. He had had the power to prevent it. He had chosen not to use that power, and the cost of that choice had been paid by the one person in his life who had never been anything but generous and good and worthy of protection. He stood very still in the dark warehouse for a long time. The burglar said something, a confused and frightened series of words about the television studio, about remembering Peter, about how Peter could have caught him and didn't, and Peter heard it all from a great distance, as though the words were arriving from another room, another life, another version of the story in which he had made a different choice in a corridor 3 days ago, and was therefore not standing here now with this knowledge inside him. It is important sitting with this moment to understand what the guilt that Peter Parker carried away from that warehouse actually was, and what it was not. It was not irrational. It was not the product of a disturbed mind or a disproportionate conscience. It was the accurate recognition of a real causal connection between his choice and a terrible outcome, and that accuracy is part of what made it so enduring and so defining. He had not been careless or malicious. He had been human. Specifically, he had been a 15-year-old boy who had just discovered he was remarkable, and had responded to that discovery by thinking first about himself, which is what 15-year-old boys do, which is what most people do when they are not yet in the habit of thinking otherwise. The moral failure was real, but it was comprehensible, and the comprehensibility of it was perhaps the cruelest part, because it meant he could not dismiss himself as simply a bad person and move on. He had to live with the knowledge that a good person, a person capable of generosity and love and genuine heroism, had on one particular evening chosen convenience over conscience, and that the universe had presented the invoice in the currency of the person he loved most. Ben Parker had spent years trying to give Peter a moral framework adequate to the life that was coming. The phrase he had returned to again and again, "with great power comes great responsibility," was not original to him, was perhaps something he had heard somewhere and adopted because it expressed something he already believed, but in his mouth it had the quality of genuine conviction rather than borrowed wisdom. He had said it to Peter in various forms and in various contexts throughout Peter's childhood, connecting it each time to some specific situation, a moment when Peter's intelligence could be used to help someone or to humiliate them, a moment when his knowledge could be shared or hoarded, a moment when the easy thing and the right thing diverged and required a choice. Peter had heard it and understood it intellectually, and filed it alongside the other pieces of adult wisdom that children accept on faith and expect to have validated by experience at some later date. He understood it now. He understood it not as a principle or a guideline or a piece of philosophy, but as the description of a mechanism, a real, physical, consequential mechanism by which power and responsibility were connected in the world, not metaphorically, but causally, not as an aspiration, but as a fact. He had the power to stop a thief, and he had not taken responsibility for stopping him, and a man was dead. The equation was complete, and it was permanent, and it could not be revised or renegotiated or wished away. It would simply be true always for the rest of his life, sitting in the centre of his understanding of himself, like a stone at the bottom of clear water, always visible, never removable, shaping the current of everything that moved above it. He left the burglar webbed to the wall with a note for the police, and the stolen money beside him, and he climbed back out through the high window and moved through the night toward home, still wearing the crude costume that had been designed for a wrestling match and a television appearance, and had become, in the space of one evening, something else entirely. The city moved around him as it always moved, indifferent, continuous, full of the ordinary business of people who had not had their lives reorganized by grief and revelation. The streetlights were the same streetlights. The sounds of the boroughs were the same sounds. Everything was exactly as it had always been, except that Peter Parker was not. What he carried home that night, and what he would carry for the rest of his life, was not simply grief for Ben, or guilt for his role in the events leading to Ben's death, though both of those things were present and both were real, and both deserved to be honoured as such. What he carried was something more structural than grief, and more durable than guilt, a fundamental revision of his understanding of what he was and what he was for. The powers he had spent the past several days enjoying, testing, profiting from, feeling proud of, were revealed in the light of this new understanding to be not a gift, but a trust. Not a reward for being remarkable, but a responsibility that had been placed in him without his consent and without a manual, and that required of him not performance or entertainment, or the modest satisfaction of his own needs, but service. Continuous, costly, frequently thankless service, to people he would never meet, in situations he could not predict. At a price he could not yet fully calculate, he understood, climbing the steps of the house on Ingram Street in the small hours of that November night, that the price had already begun to be paid, that the accounting had started with Ben Parker's life and would continue in currencies he couldn't yet name. He understood, though he could not have articulated it in these terms, that he had just been handed the purpose that would define his existence, and that the purpose had been handed to him not as an honour but as a consequence, not as a beginning but as a reckoning. He was Spider-Man now, not because the spider had bitten him, but because of what he had allowed to happen in a corridor and what that allowing had cost. The costume was no longer a disguise for a television entertainer. It was a penance. It was a promise. It was the form that his love for Ben Parker would take, in the absence of Ben Parker, for as long as he lived. And somewhere beneath all of this, beneath the grief and the guilt and the newly clarified sense of purpose, something else was also quietly settling into place in Peter's understanding of himself. Something he would not examine directly for years, because examining it would require a kind of self-knowledge that takes time to develop, and because the surface of his grief was demanding all of his immediate attention. The thing that was settling into place was this, a belief, not chosen, but absorbed, that his happiness had been the price, that the spider's gift and the television appearances and the prize money and the warm glow of being finally, publicly remarkable, that all of that had been the setup for what followed, and that what followed was the correction, the universe's way of making clear that joy of that kind, uncomplicated and unearned and self-directed, was not something he was permitted to keep. He had been happy, Ben had died. These two things were not rationally connected, but grief is not rational, and 15-year-old boys processing the worst night of their lives are not operating in the register of rational analysis. They are operating in the register of meaning, of pattern, of the stories that experience seems to be telling about what kind of person you are and what kind of life you're allowed to live. The story that Peter Parker absorbed that night, in the warehouse and on the walk home and in the quiet of his bedroom while Aunt May slept down the hall in a house that would never again contain the sound of Ben's footsteps, was not a story he would ever consciously endorse or deliberately choose to believe. But it took up residence in him nonetheless, settling into the architecture of his self-understanding with the permanence of something that arrives during a formative moment and finds the walls still soft. He was not meant to be happy. Happiness was what existed before the invoice arrived. From here, there was only the work and the responsibility and the long, earnest, costly attempt to become someone worthy of the man who had loved him and whom he had, in one moment of ordinary human selfishness, failed to protect. He would spend the rest of his life trying to make that right, and the rest of his life would never quite feel like enough. The work, as Peter had come to understand it on that November night, required resources that heroism alone could not provide. It required web fluid, which required chemicals, which required money. It required a costume that could withstand the demands of climbing buildings and stopping criminals and moving through the city at speeds and angles that ordinary fabric was not designed to accommodate, which required materials, which required money. It required, most pressingly and most mundanely, the continued operation of the household on Ingram Street, where Aunt May was now alone in a way she had never been before, managing the finances of a modest home on a single income that had just been reduced to whatever she could bring in herself, paying the bills that Ben had always handled with a quiet competence that May was only now discovering the full extent of, because the full extent of it had never needed to be discussed while he was alive to manage it. All of this required money, and Peter Parker, a 15 years old and the secret protector of a city that did not know his name, had very little of it and no obvious means of getting more that did not involve either abandoning his responsibilities or finding some way to make those responsibilities pay. The solution, when it came to him, had the quality of the best solutions. It seemed obvious in retrospect and had required a specific combination of circumstances and personality to produce. Peter had always been handy with a camera. It was one of the hobbies that had filled the quiet hours of his adolescence, a way of looking at the world that suited his scientific mind and his tendency to notice details that other people overlooked. He owned a decent camera, a birthday gift from Ben purchased second-hand but in good condition, and he understood its mechanics with the thoroughness he brought to everything he chose to understand. And he was, by definition, present at every Spider-Man incident in the city of New York. positioned with an intimacy and an access that no other photographer could match or even approximate. The logic assembled itself during one of his early patrols, watching from a rooftop as police responded to the aftermath of a robbery he had just interrupted, and recognizing that the scene below him, the webbed criminals, the recovered stolen property, the evidence of Spider-Man's intervention, was exactly the kind of dramatic visual content that newspapers paid for. If the Daily Bugle wanted pictures of Spider-Man, and it clearly did, given the column inches it was already devoting to coverage of the city's newest masked figure, then someone needed to be taking those pictures. Someone with access. Someone who could set up a camera before an encounter and arrange himself within its frame while simultaneously conducting the encounter. Someone who was, in the most literal possible sense, both the subject and the photographer. The technical challenges were considerable and required weeks of experimentation before he arrived at a reliable system. Miniaturized timers, cameras mounted on surfaces with small adhesive mechanisms that echoed the biology of his own fingertips, carefully calculated angles that would capture dramatic images of Spider-Man in action without requiring a second person behind the lens. He had to learn, essentially. To choreograph himself, to be aware during the fluid and unpredictable business of stopping criminals of where the camera was and what it was seeing, to position himself for images that would communicate the essence of what Spider-Man was without communicating anything about who Peter Parker might be underneath the mask. It was an extraordinary technical achievement that he accomplished quietly, without assistance, in the basement workshop that had once been Ben's and that still smelled, faintly and heartbreakingly, of the older man's projects and tools. The Daily Bugle occupied a building in Midtown Manhattan that expressed, in its architecture and its atmosphere, the personality of the man who ran it. J. Jonah Jameson had built the paper into one of New York's most read dailies through a combination of genuine journalistic instinct, an aggressive editorial voice, and a talent for identifying the stories that the city's residents most wanted to argue about over their morning coffee. The building was loud with the sound of typewriters and ringing phones and people moving quickly between desks, with the purposeful energy of an institution that believed its work was urgent and consequential. It was not a comfortable place in the way that comfortable places are comfortable. It was the kind of environment that rewarded a certain kind of person, quick, thick-skinned, capable of absorbing criticism and deadline pressure with equal equanimity, and that processed everyone else into a fine powder and used it as filler. Peter walked into this environment for the first time carrying his first batch of Spider-Man photographs, and the photographs were good. He knew they were good because he had looked at them with the honest eye of someone who understood both the technical standards of the medium and the specific requirements of newspaper front pages, and they met both criteria with the kind of clean authority that good work has. He was nervous in the way that everyone is nervous when they want something from someone who has the power to withhold it, but he was also steady in the way that someone is steady when they know the quality of what they are bringing to the table. He found his way to the right desk and showed his work and watched the reaction, and the reaction confirmed what he had assessed. Jonah Jameson was not a man who received visitors with warmth or expressed approval through anything other than the grudging recognition that certain things were commercially useful. His first response to Peter's photographs was professional. These were images that would sell papers, and selling papers was the fundamental organizing principle of his existence. But almost simultaneously with this professional recognition, something else was happening in Jameson's response to the photographs and to the subject they depicted, something that went beyond commercial calculation into a territory that was more personal and more complicated. He looked at Spider-Man in those images, masked, anonymous, powerful, operating outside the institutional structures of law enforcement and civic authority, and something in him recoiled. Jameson's hostility towards Spider-Man was not simple, and it deserves more than simple treatment. He was a man who had built his career and his identity on the principle of accountability, on the belief that power without transparency was inherently dangerous, that institutions and individuals who operated without oversight were a threat to the social order that made civilized life possible. His newspaper was, among other things, an instrument of accountability, shining light into the corners where power preferred to operate in darkness. Against this background, a masked vigilante who answered to no one, whose identity was unknown, whose methods were unregulated, and who was rapidly becoming a figure of public admiration, represented something genuinely troubling to a man of Jameson's convictions, not because Spider-Man was obviously doing harm, but because his very existence challenged the principles that Jameson had organized his life around. The mask was the thing. The mask, to Jameson, was not a practical necessity but a moral failing. The choice of someone who wanted the benefits of public regard without the accountability that public identity required. There was almost certainly something more personal operating as well, something that Jameson himself probably never examined with full honesty. A recognition, somewhere beneath his conscious awareness, that Spider-Man was genuinely heroic in a way that made ordinary human achievement look modest by comparison. And that this recognition produced a discomfort that expressed itself as hostility rather than admiration. But this is speculation, and Jameson was not a man who invited speculation about his interior life. And what mattered practically was the campaign he launched against Spider-Man in the pages of his newspaper. A campaign that was relentless and influential, and that shaped public perception of the masked hero for years, in ways that had real consequences for Peter's ability to operate. The editorials appeared regularly, their rhetoric consistent and escalating. Spider-Man was a menace, a vigilante operating outside the law, probably a criminal himself, certainly a bad influence on young people who might get the idea that taking the law into their own hands was acceptable, possibly connected to the very criminals he appeared to be fighting. The logic was not always airtight, but it was delivered with Jameson's characteristic authority, and authority delivered with sufficient confidence tends to fill the space where careful argument would otherwise be required. A significant portion of New York's population came to view Spider-Man with suspicion, because J. Jonah Jameson told them to, week after week, in a newspaper that arrived on their doorstep every morning, and that they trusted because it had been telling them the truth more or less about everything else. Peter read these editorials. He read them at the kitchen table in the house on Ingram Street, over breakfast, before school, and he read them with the particular quality of attention that comes from reading about yourself in a context where you cannot respond or defend yourself, or provide the information that would reframe the entire picture. He could not write a letter to the editor explaining that Spider-Man was, in fact, a 15-year-old boy from Queens who was doing this because his uncle had been shot, and he felt responsible for it, and this was the only form of penance that seemed adequate to the debt. He could not point out that the anonymous photographer who was providing the Bugle with its most dramatic images was the same person the paper was simultaneously vilifying. He could only read and absorb and notice the way that Jameson's characterization of Spider-Man, reckless, self-aggrandizing, probably dangerous, aligned with the worst version of the fears Peter already had about himself. This is the particular cruelty of Jameson's campaign as it operated on Peter Parker specifically, separate from its effect on Spider-Man's public reputation. Peter was already inclined, for reasons that had everything to do with Uncle Ben and the warehouse, and the security guard's face, to interpret his own heroism with suspicion, to question whether his motivations were as pure as they needed to be, to worry that some residue of the selfish boy who had let a thief walk past him was still present and still operative in his choices. Jameson's editorials arrived into this existing anxiety and amplified it, providing an external voice for the internal critic that Peter could not entirely silence. The publisher thought Spider-Man was a menace. Peter sometimes thought Spider-Man was a menace. They were not thinking this for the same reasons, but the resonance between the external condemnation and the internal doubt was uncomfortable in a way that Peter could never quite reason himself out of. He kept selling the photographs anyway because he needed the money, and because Jameson kept buying them, and because the arrangement, however absurd its structure, was the only financially viable option available to him. The economics of it were as follows. Peter risked his life stopping criminals as Spider-Man, then risked his reputation photographing those exploits, then walked into the building of the man who was publicly calling him a menace, and sold the photographs for amounts that Jameson negotiated down with the cheerful ruthlessness of someone who knew he had leverage. The rate Jameson paid was never quite what the photographs were worth, and Jameson knew this, and Peter knew it, and neither of them ever discussed it directly because the power differential between a teenager selling freelance photographs and the publisher of a major daily newspaper was too large to pretend away and too permanent to be usefully dwelt upon. What the money bought, month by month and photograph by photograph, was the continued operation of the life that made the heroism possible. Aunt May's bills were paid, more or less. with the constant low-grade anxiety of someone managing a modest budget without margin for the unexpected. The web fluid chemicals were purchased in small quantities from various suppliers, spread across enough different transactions to avoid attracting attention. The costume was repaired and gradually improved. The crude initial design replaced over time with something more functional, more durable, and more suited to the specific demands of moving through a city at the angles and speeds that Spider-Man required. These were not glamorous expenditures. They were the maintenance costs of a heroic career, and they arrived every month with the reliability of all maintenance costs everywhere, indifferent to whether the month had been a good one or a difficult one, whether Peter was managing well or barely holding on. Betty Brant was the first person at the Bugle who treated Peter as a person rather than a transaction, and the relief of this was considerable enough to shape the nature of their relationship from the beginning. She was several years older than Peter, working as Jameson's secretary with a competence and grace that came from having had to be capable and self-sufficient earlier than most people are required to be. She had her own history of loss and family difficulty, her own experience of the world as a place that made demands before it offered comforts, and this experience had produced in her a quality of attentiveness to other people that expressed itself as genuine rather than performed kindness. When Peter appeared at her desk, nervous and young and trying to appear neither, she responded to the person in front of her rather than to the category he represented. The relationship that developed between them was real, and it deserves to be honoured as such, but it was also, from the beginning, structured by the same limitation that would structure every relationship Peter entered for years: the invisible wall of the secret. The specific absence at the centre of every conversation, where the most important truths about his life would have gone if he could have said them. Betty liked Peter Parker, the photographer, the bright and slightly awkward boy who showed up with extraordinary pictures and stayed to talk, and was clearly more interesting than he seemed to know. She did not know, could not know, that Peter Parker spent his nights hanging upside down from buildings and being described as a public menace in the newspaper where she worked. The gap between what she knew and what was true was not a casual gap. It was the essential condition of their relationship, the thing that made genuine intimacy structurally impossible, while also being something Peter could not address, without consequences he was not prepared to manage. The trap that Peter had built for himself, or that circumstances had built for him, or that some collaboration of the two had produced, was elegant in its completeness. He needed money. So he needed the photographs, so he needed Spider-Man, so he needed to maintain the secret, so he needed the photographs to be of someone whose identity was unverifiable, so he needed the mask, so he needed the secret, so he needed to be, always and permanently, the person in the room who knew more than he could say. The loop closed on itself without exits. He could not be a photographer without being Spider-Man, could not be Spider-Man without being a photographer, could not maintain either identity without protecting the secret that connected them, and could not protect the secret without accepting a fundamental incompleteness in every relationship and every public version of himself. The Daily Bugle was, in this sense, not simply an employer or an antagonist, or a convenient plot mechanism in the story of Peter Parker's early heroic career. It was the institution that most precisely embodied the central irony of his situation, the place where his heroism was simultaneously documented and condemned, where the visual evidence of his sacrifice was purchased and then weaponized against him, where the man who profited most directly from Spider-Man's existence was also the man most publicly committed to his destruction. Peter walked into that building every week or two with photographs that proved he was doing something genuinely valuable, and walked out with enough money to continue doing it, and with Jameson's latest editorial ringing in his ears, and the combination of these two things, the validation of the work and the condemnation of the worker, was one he could share with no one and process only in the private space of his own mind, where the spider sense had no jurisdiction, and the web shooters offered no assistance, and the only resources available were the ones he had always had, which were considerable, but which were not quite sufficient to make any of this feel like anything other than exactly what it was. He kept going anyway. He kept going because Ben had taught him to keep going, because the alternative was a version of himself he refused to become, because somewhere in the city on any given night there was someone who needed Spider-Man more than Peter needed any of the things he was giving up to be Spider-Man. He kept going, and he sold the photographs, and he read the editorials, and he paid the bills, and he maintained the secret, and he accepted the incompleteness of everything as the standing cost of the life he had chosen, or that had chosen him, or that had assembled itself around him in the aftermath of a spider bite, and a security guard's voice calling out in a studio corridor, and the terrible, clarifying silence of a hospital waiting room on a November Thursday. The economics of heroism, it turned out, were not so different from the economics of everything else. You paid what you had. You hoped it was enough. You went back to work in the morning. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs specifically to people who are keeping a significant secret. And it is different in quality from ordinary loneliness in ways that are worth dwelling on before the story moves further forward. Ordinary loneliness is the absence of connection, the experience of wanting to be known and finding no one available or willing to do the knowing. The loneliness of the secret keeper is more complicated than that, because it coexists with connection, sometimes with genuine and warm connection, and derives its particular ache precisely from that coexistence. You are in the room, people are glad you're there, conversation flows and laughter happens and real affection moves between you and the other people present. And underneath all of it, continuous and unignorable, is the awareness that none of them are responding to the complete version of you, that the thing they are connecting with is a partial construction, a carefully maintained presentation of selected truths, and that the most important facts about your life are sitting just below the surface of every exchange, shaping everything, and acknowledged by no one. Peter Parker had been living inside this particular loneliness since the night of Uncle Ben's death, and by the time his junior year of high school was giving way to his senior year, it had become so much the baseline condition of his existence that he had almost stopped noticing it as a distinct feature of his experience. It was simply how things were. It was the water he swam in. The closest he came to acknowledging it directly was in those moments, occasional and somewhat disorienting, when he caught himself wanting to tell someone something true about his life and then remembering, in the half-second before the words formed, that he could not. The wanting was real. The impossibility was real. The gap between them was the loneliness, and it was always there, and it was the price of the secret, and the secret was the price of everything else, and so the loneliness was simply part of what heroism cost, to be accepted alongside the physical dangers and the financial pressures and the public condemnation of Jay. Jonah Jameson's editorial page, Betty Brant in the context of this loneliness, represented something genuinely important to Peter during the period when their relationship was at its warmest. Not a solution to the loneliness, because no relationship built on a concealed identity could fully address the specific ache of being only partially known, but a partial remedy, a place where some of the warmth he was otherwise denying himself could be received without immediately threatening everything he was trying to protect. She was kind to him in a way that was not condescending, respected his intelligence without making him perform it, and offered a version of adult connection that his high school social landscape could not provide. For a boy who had spent years being invisible to the people around him, being genuinely seen by someone, even partially, even through the particular filter of what he was able to share, was nourishing in a way he had not expected to need as much as he did. Betty's own history had given her a quality of practical warmth and unsentimental affection that suited Peter's situation better than more demanding forms of emotional intimacy would have. She'd grown up quickly, taken on responsibilities early, and developed from this experience a capacity for caring about people, without requiring them to be uncomplicated or fully transparent. She did not push Peter on the things he couldn't explain, the sudden departures, the occasional bruises, the way he sometimes arrived looking like someone who had been awake all night doing something he was not going to describe. She noticed these things. She was not incurious about them. But she had sufficient respect for the boundaries of other people, learned from her own need for such respect, to allow him his mysteries without making them a condition of her continued affection. What she could not do, and what the relationship could not survive indefinitely in the absence of, was close the distance that the secret created. Peter cared about her genuinely, and she cared about him, and the caring was real on both sides, and it was not enough to make the relationship into something stable and lasting, because the foundation it would have needed, the mutual transparency, the shared knowledge of who each person actually was and what their life actually contained, was not available. Peter could not give her the truth. Without the truth, he could only give her a version of himself that was always slightly strained by the effort of maintenance, always slightly hollow at the centre where the most important things would have been if he could have said them. Betty, who was perceptive and who had her own intuitions about the shape of things, felt this hollowness without being able to name it, and it created in her a background unease that expressed itself as occasional worry and occasional frustration, and the gradual reluctant recognition that whatever Peter Parker was, and whatever he was involved in, was larger and more dangerous than anything he was willing to share with her. The situation was further complicated by the way that Betty's life intersected with the world that Spider-Man moved through. Her brother Bennett's involvement with criminals, his debts, and his dangerous associations brought the dangers of Peter's heroic life directly into contact with his personal one, in a way that he had not anticipated and could not manage without cost to both. The people who threatened Bennett threatened Betty by extension, and the line between Peter Parker's desire to protect someone he cared about and Spider-Man's obligation to intervene in situations involving criminal activity became impossible to maintain as a meaningful distinction. He was always both things simultaneously, and the situations that made this most apparent were also the situations that made the pretense of separation most untenable. The ending of whatever it was that Peter and Betty had, it resists the word relationship, because it never quite solidified into something with clear enough edges to be ended in any formal sense, was not dramatic or bitter. It was more like a gradual acknowledgement on both their parts that the thing between them was not going to grow into what it might have been under different circumstances, and that the different circumstances were not available, and that continuing to pretend otherwise was a kindness to neither of them. Betty eventually found her way towards someone else, someone whose life was less occluded and whose presence was more consistently available, and Peter watched this happen with a sadness that was entirely uncomplicated by any desire to prevent it. He had not given her what she deserved. He had given her what he had, which was something real but incomplete, and he knew the difference even if naming it clearly required honesty about his own limitations that he was not yet fully capable of. Liz Allen occupied a different register of Peter's emotional life during his high school years, and understanding her place in his story requires a brief account of what desire looks like when it is primarily a function of exclusion rather than genuine recognition. Liz was popular in the way that certain teenagers are popular, effortlessly, completely, in possession of whatever quality it is that makes a social environment organize itself around a person's presence and preferences. She was not unkind, which distinguished her from some of the people in her orbit, but she was also not, during Peter's high school years, particularly interested in him, because he did not register in the social calculus that governed her daily experience as someone worth the expenditure of attention. Peter was background, furniture, the class brain who could be useful during exam periods and safely ignored at all other times. What Peter felt for Liz, in the period before his transformation and in the months immediately following it, was not love in any meaningful sense, and he would have been the first to acknowledge this if he had been examining it honestly, which he largely was not. It was something closer to the desire for recognition from a source that had consistently withheld it, the particular pull toward people who have not yet decided you are worth seeing, the hope that their eventual recognition would constitute a kind of validation that the people who already saw you clearly could not provide. Aunt May loved him, but Aunt May was obligated to love him by the structure of their family. Ben had loved him, and Ben was gone. Betty liked him, but Betty worked at a newspaper and was several years older and occupied a context in which Peter's awkwardness was less conspicuous. Flash Thompson's contempt had shaped Peter's understanding of his own social worth for years in ways that were not rational but were nonetheless real, and Liz Allen, who moved through Flash's world with complete ease, represented in Peter's imagination something like the verdict of the social order that had found him wanting, a verdict that her eventual interest in him might, he unconsciously hoped, revise or overturn. When Liz began to notice Peter, in the weeks after his physical transformation, had made him more confident and his newfound sense of capability had altered the way he carried himself through the hallways of Midtown High. The experience was gratifying in the immediate and shallow way that it was always going to be. She smiled at him in the hall. She found reasons to be near him. She said his name in a tone that contained something warmer than the neutral indifference she had previously maintained. And Peter, who was 15 and then 16, and who had needs that were entirely human and entirely understandable, responded to this attention with something that felt in the moment like it might be important, but that revealed itself on closer examination to be primarily the relief of no longer being invisible to someone who had previously looked through him. The complication, which arrived quickly, and which Peter had not thought through in advance, was that Liz's interest in him created exactly the kind of social attention that was most dangerous for someone trying to maintain a secret identity. Being noticed by Liz meant being noticed by everyone around Liz, which meant being the subject of conversations and speculation, and the kind of social scrutiny that popular teenagers direct at whoever their popular friends are currently interested in. Flash Thompson, whose feelings about Peter's new status in Liz's social world were a fascinating tangle of competitive resentment and baffled confusion, became more rather than less attentive to Peter's behaviour as a result, watching for evidence of whatever it was that had changed about the boy he had always dismissed and finding the evidence frustratingly absent. You could not see what was different about Peter Parker. You could only feel it, the new solidity of his presence, the way he no longer flinched or deflected or made himself smaller in response to social pressure. And it was maddening to Flash in ways he could not articulate, because articulating them would have required acknowledging how much of his own identity had been built on the foundation of Peter's previous smallness. The dynamic that emerged among Peter, Liz, Flash, and the wider social ecosystem of Midtown High during this period was one that Peter navigated with the same divided attention that characterized everything in his life. One part of his mind on the immediate social situation, another part monitoring the city for the spider sense disturbances that indicated someone somewhere needed Spider-Man, and a third part always running in the background, calculating the risks that each new relationship or social development represented to the secret that made all the other things possible. He liked Liz. He was glad she was paying attention to him. He also understood, with the part of his mind that had been sharpened by the specific kind of vigilance that secret-keeping requires, that her interest in him was something he would need to manage carefully, and that management was not the same thing as connection, and that a relationship built primarily on management and careful revelation of selected truths was going to have the same structural limitations as every other relationship he was capable of entering. What is most revealing about Peter's romantic life during his high school years is not the specific contours of his feelings for Betty or Liz, or the other girls who moved through his awareness during this period, but the pattern that was beginning to emerge across all of them. A pattern that, once visible, is impossible to look away from because it speaks so directly to the central question this story is exploring. Every relationship Peter entered was already compromised before it began. Not by bad intentions on his part or bad character on the part of the women involved, but by the structural impossibility of full disclosure. He could not tell anyone who he was. He could not be, in any relationship, the complete version of himself, and the part of himself that he was concealing was not peripheral or incidental, but absolutely central. It was his purpose, his guilt, his grief, his reason for being. The organizing principle of his daily existence, and the thing that accounted for every unexplained absence and every mysterious bruise, and every conversation that stopped just short of the truth. The question that this pattern invites, and it is a question worth sitting with, because it does not have a simple answer, is whether the secret was the reason Peter could not be fully loved, or whether the secret was, at some level, a structure that he maintained in part because it provided a comprehensible external explanation for an internal belief he would not have chosen to examine if the external explanation were unavailable. He believed, somewhere beneath his conscious awareness, that he was not the kind of person who got to have uncomplicated happiness. He had believed this since the night in the warehouse, and possibly since before that. Since the particular quality of the love in the house on Ingram Street had first made him aware of the absence at its centre. The secret gave him a practical, defensible, entirely real reason why closeness was always limited, why relationships always had a ceiling, why the people who cared about him could never quite reach all the way to the centre of his life. If there had been no secret, he would have needed to find some other reason. Because the limitation was not, at its deepest level, strategic. It was a reflection of what he believed he deserved. The girls he could not protect, and the more precise framing is the people he could not fully let in, were not casualties of his heroism in any simple sense. They were evidence of a pattern that was assembling itself in the lived texture of his daily experience. Each partial connection and each careful withholding adding another data point to an argument he was unconsciously building about his own life. He was someone who moved through relationships like Spider-Man moved through the city, at speed, at angles that ordinary people didn't use, always heading somewhere else, always in the middle of something more urgent than staying. The web that connected him to the people he cared about was real and strong, but it was also, always, something he could release when the time came, because releasing was part of the mechanics, and because some part of him had always understood from the very beginning that the web was not meant to hold him in one place. It was meant to carry him forward, through the city, through the night, toward whatever needed him next, leaving behind the warmth of the house on Ingram Street and the kindness of the people who wished he would stay longer, because staying was not, in the end, what he was for. He was 16 years old, and the pattern was already fully formed, and he did not yet have the language or the distance to see it for what it was. He would be much older before that happened, and by then the pattern would have written itself across enough of his life that seeing it clearly would require the specific courage of someone willing to look honestly at the story they have been telling themselves for a very long time. That courage was coming. It was just not here yet. For now, there was only the daily business of being Peter Parker, of selling photographs and paying bills and going to school and monitoring the city and caring about people he could not fully let in the only ways that the life he was living made available to him. Empire State University arrived in Peter Parker's life like a door opening onto a larger room. The same person walking through it, carrying all the same histories and limitations and quietly maintained beliefs about what he was entitled to expect from the world, but suddenly surrounded by a wider and more complex social landscape than Midtown High had offered, one that demanded new adaptations and provided new possibilities and contained, as it turned out, both the deepest friendship and the most consequential enemy that his story would produce. The transition from high school to university is, for most people, a period of reinvention. The opportunity to be seen fresh by people who carry no prior assumptions about who you are and what you are worth. For Peter, this opportunity was both real and structurally limited in the ways that all his opportunities were structurally limited. The secret running beneath everything like groundwater, shaping the terrain without ever being visible on the surface. The campus of Empire State University occupied a section of Manhattan, with the comfortable confidence of an institution that had been there long enough to feel like part of the city's permanent architecture rather than something built within it. The science facilities were everything that Peter's high school chemistry sets had been preparing him for. Laboratories, equipped with instruments that could measure things he had previously only been able to theorize about. Research libraries that contained the full depth of human scientific knowledge in physical form. Faculty members who had spent their careers at the edges of what was understood and who had the particular quality of intellectual excitement that comes from living in proximity to the genuinely unknown. For someone with Peter's relationship to science, which was not simply academic but deeply personal, science being the language in which his mind naturally moved, and the framework through which he had always made sense of the world, ESU represented a kind of homecoming, an environment finely calibrated to the full range of what he was capable of. It was in the science corridor during his first week that he encountered Harry Osborn for the first time, and the encounter was not immediately promising. Harry had the particular social ease of someone who had grown up wealthy enough to never need to perform competence for anyone's approval. The ease that comes not from confidence in one's own abilities, but from the deep background assumption that the world will arrange itself around one's preferences because it always has. He was not arrogant in the way that some wealthy teenagers are arrogant, which is to say he was not cruel or dismissive toward people he considered beneath him. He was simply accustomed to being liked, accustomed to his presence being welcomed, accustomed to the social friction that other people experienced as a constant feature of their daily lives being largely absent from his. He looked at Peter Parker that first day with the genuine curiosity of someone who had encountered a person who did not immediately conform to any of his existing categories, and this curiosity, which was one of Harry's genuinely good qualities, was the thing that made friendship possible between two people who had very little obvious reason to seek each other out. Peter's initial wariness about Harry was not snobbery in reverse. He did not resent wealth, or distrust the wealthy as a category. It was more specific than that. He recognized, with the particular perceptiveness of someone who had spent years monitoring social dynamics from a position of exclusion, that Harry's desire for genuine friendship was real, and was also shaped by his experience of being surrounded by people who wanted things from him rather than from him specifically. Harry was lonely in the specific way that very privileged people can be lonely, unable to trust that anyone in their orbit is present for reasons unconnected to the privilege. He wanted Peter's friendship partly because Peter was conspicuously unimpressed by the Osborne name, and uninterested in whatever access to wealth and social status that friendship might provide, and this indifference, experienced by Harry as refreshing authenticity, was in Peter's case simply the natural result of having concerns too immediate and too serious to leave room for the kind of social calculation that Harry's other acquaintances apparently engaged in. The friendship that developed between them over the course of that first semester was genuine in both directions, built on the kind of daily proximity and accumulated small kindnesses that constitute the actual material of close friendship, as opposed to its more dramatic expressions. They ate together in the cafeteria and complained together about coursework and developed the shared vocabulary of reference and private humour that marks a friendship that has found its own private language. Harry's generosity expressed itself constantly and casually, picking up the check, offering rides, providing access to the kind of social events and environments that Peter's budget would never have made available. And Peter's response to this generosity was always slightly strained by the guilt of accepting help from someone so much better resourced than himself. A guilt that Harry found baffling and endearing in roughly equal measure because he had never been required to think about money in any way that made accepting help from a friend feel like a moral complication. What Peter could not give Harry, and what Harry's friendship most needed, was complete honesty. The secret stood between them as it stood between Peter and everyone else, creating a particular awkwardness in the specific context of their friendship, because Harry was more curious about Peter's life, and more attentive to its inconsistencies than most people in Peter's social world. He noticed the absences. He noticed the injuries that Peter attributed to clumsiness with insufficient conviction. He noticed the way Peter sometimes seemed to be listening to something inaudible to everyone else, the spider sense registering disturbances in the city's background noise that Harry could neither hear nor understand. He did not press. He was at his core a person who respected other people's privacy, because his own privacy had so rarely been respected, who understood that friendship did not require complete transparency to be real, but the gaps in his knowledge of his best friend's life were present, and shaped the friendship's boundaries in ways that Peter was always aware of, and always slightly sorry about. It was through Harry that Peter first entered the social orbit of Norman Osborn, and the experience of meeting Harry's father for the first time produced in Peter, via the spider sense and via something older and less classifiable than that, a response that he did not fully trust but could not entirely dismiss. Norman Osborn in person was impressive in the way that people who have achieved significant power through significant intelligence tend to be impressive. There was a density to him, a quality of compressed force, as though his ordinary social interactions represented only a fraction of the energy and attention he was capable of deploying. He received Peter with the calculating assessment that he apparently directed at everyone in his environment, measuring and categorizing with an efficiency that was only slightly disguised by the social forms of polite conversation. He was interested in Peter in the way that a chess player is interested in a piece whose capabilities have not yet been fully established, not warmly, not unkindly, but with the specific attention of someone who's always thinking several moves ahead. The shadow that Norman cast over his relationship with Harry was visible to anyone paying attention, and Peter paid attention. Harry spoke of his father with a mixture of pride and longing that was painful to witness, because its structure was so transparent, the pride serving as a form of preemptive defense against the disappointment that the longing suggested was chronic and familiar. Norman's expectations of Harry were not cruel in their articulation, but were crushing in their weight, premised on the assumption that Harry's primary purpose was to be adequate to the Osborne legacy, which was a standard that Harry, who was warm and generous and socially gifted but not a genius and not driven by ambition in the way his father was driven, could not consistently meet. The love between them was real, but it was conditional, in ways that Norman probably did not intend, and Harry could not help but feel, and the gap between what Harry needed from his father and what Norman was capable of providing was one of the defining facts of Harry's emotional life, the wound that would eventually be exploited by things that neither of them could yet foresee. Gwen Stacy arrived in Peter's life during his first semester at ESU with a quality that he had never quite encountered before in anyone he was drawn to, which was the quality of being entirely herself without apparent effort or performance. She was intelligent in a way that expressed itself as genuine curiosity rather than as competitive demonstration. She wanted to understand things, asked questions because she actually wanted the answers, listened to other people's ideas with the full attention that most people reserve for the sound of their own voice. She was beautiful in a way that she seemed largely unaware of, or at least unbothered by, which gave her a quality of ease and directness that stood in striking contrast to the self-consciousness that beauty sometimes produced in people who had organized their social identity around it. She was her father's daughter in the most fundamental sense, having absorbed from Captain George Stacy a basic moral seriousness and a commitment to doing the right thing that were not performed values but actual ones, visible in her daily choices in ways that made them credible. Her father was himself a figure worth understanding before the story moves further. Captain George Stacy of the New York City Police Department was a man who had spent a career in service of the principle that institutions existed to protect people, and who had maintained his faith in this principle through sufficient exposure to the gap between the principle and its daily practice to make that faith earned rather than naive. He was respected by his colleagues in the way that people are respected when their competence and their integrity are both beyond question, a combination rarer in any profession than it should be, and one that produced in the people around him a quality of trust that was not automatic but was genuinely warranted. He had also, through the combination of professional observation and personal intelligence, formed views about Spider-Man that were significantly more nuanced than anything Jonah Jameson was publishing, views that allowed for the possibility that a masked vigilante operating outside institutional structures might nonetheless be a genuine force for good in a city that needed all the help it could find. Peter's awareness of Gwen as someone he wanted to know more fully arrived in stages, as real awareness tends to arrive, not as a single moment of recognition, but as an accumulation of smaller moments that gradually assembled themselves into a conclusion he had not set out to reach. The way she argued with a professor about an interpretation she disagreed with, not aggressively, but with a quiet precision that made her position irrefutable. The way she responded to Harry's jokes with a warmth that was genuine rather than obligatory. The way she looked at Peter during one of their first real conversations, with the specific attentiveness of someone who was actually listening to what he was saying rather than waiting for her turn to speak, and the way this attentiveness produced in him the disorienting sensation of being seen more fully than he was accustomed to being seen, which felt both wonderful and slightly dangerous. The early stages of whatever was developing between Peter and Gwen were complicated by the same forces that complicated everything in his life, but they were complicated in a new way, because Gwen's perceptiveness meant that the partial version of himself he was able to offer her was more conspicuously partial than it had been with Betty, who had been more willing to accept gaps without pressing on them. Gwen noticed the absences and asked about them, not intrusively, but with the directness of someone who assumed that friends were honest with each other and found the assumption being violated in confusing ways. She noticed the way Peter sometimes seemed distracted by things she couldn't perceive. She noticed the injuries. She noticed the particular quality of his attention when something was happening in the city outside, the slight shift in his posture, the momentary unfocusing of his eyes, and she found these things interesting rather than dismissible, which meant she continued to look at them in ways that required Peter to work harder at the maintenance of his carefully partial presentation. Norman Osborn's transformation into the Green Goblin is a story that has been told many times with varying degrees of attention to its psychological dimensions, and it is the psychological dimensions that matter most in the context of this particular account. The chemical accident that exposed him to an experimental formula he had been developing was not simply a physical event that altered his capabilities. It was the release of something that had already been present in him, the rage and resentment and megalomaniacal hunger for dominance that his disciplined intelligence and social ambition had kept organized and directed into legitimate channels, now freed from those channels and given a costume and a set of weapons and a philosophical framework that cast ordinary moral constraints as the weaknesses of inferior minds. The Green Goblin was not a separate entity that invaded Norman Osborn. It was Norman Osborn with his restraints removed, his darkest impulses given permission to express themselves without the filtering that civilization normally requires. His campaign against Spider-Man began as the criminal ambition of a man who wanted to establish dominance over the New York underworld and saw the masked hero as an obstacle to this ambition, but it became something more personal with a speed that reflected how personal it had always been beneath the surface framing. The Goblin's intelligence, Norman's intelligence operating without ethical constraints, recognized in Spider-Man an opponent worth taking seriously. And taking something seriously was for Norman Osborn always the first step toward obsession. He studied Spider-Man with the thoroughness that he brought to all problems of consequence, analysing fighting patterns and equipment and the specific quality of the hero's moral reasoning, and what he found in this analysis was something that neither confirmed his contempt nor settled his obsession. He found someone principled and genuinely capable, and this combination was the most threatening thing Norman could encounter because it suggested an opponent who would not be bought or frightened or reasoned out of the field. The discovery of Spider-Man's identity was not achieved through a single dramatic moment of revelation, but through the patient application of considerable resources over considerable time. Norman had access to investigative tools and analytical capabilities that were simply not available to ordinary criminals, and he used them with the systematic thoroughness of a scientist approaching a research problem. The trail led, as trails of sufficient length and specificity always eventually led in Peter Parker's world, back to the house on Ingram Street, back to the boy from Queens, back to the photographer who sold pictures to the Daily Bugle, back to the awkward and remarkable person who was his son's closest friend. The moment when Norman understood the full shape of what he had discovered produced in him something more complex than simple triumph. Though triumph was certainly present, it produced a kind of reorganization of his existing feelings. His contempt for Spider-Man refracted now through the personal lens of betrayal. The masked hero transformed from an abstract obstacle into a specific person who had been present in his home, at his dinner table, in proximity to Harry, all while concealing the identity that made him Norman's enemy. The betrayal was not rational. Peter had no more obligation to reveal himself to Norman Osborn than to anyone else. But Norman's psychology had never operated primarily through rational categories, and the feeling of having been deceived by someone he had allowed near his family was real and was toxic, and added a dimension of personal fury to the existing professional animosity that made the resulting confrontation significantly more dangerous than it would otherwise have been. The confrontation in which Norman revealed his knowledge of Peter's identity, arriving in Peter's neighbourhood with the theatrical cruelty of someone who wanted the violation to be felt as a violation, was the first catastrophic collapse of the boundary between Peter's two lives. The first time the careful separation he maintained between Peter Parker and Spider-Man was breached by an external force with the capability and the intention to weaponize the connection. Everything that Peter had most feared about his secret being known was now real. Someone who wished him harm knew exactly who he was and exactly where to find the people he loved. The psychological impact of this was enormous and lasting, adding to the existing architecture of his anxiety a new and acute awareness that his protections were permeable, that the wall he maintained around his personal life was not in fact a wall, but a screen, and that the screen had always been thinner than he wanted to believe. The amnesia that ended the confrontation, Norman's memories of his time as the Green Goblin erased by the chemical consequences of their battle, leaving him without knowledge of Peter's identity or his own criminal activities, was a resolution that resolved nothing in any durable sense. It was a pause, not an ending. It left Peter in the position of knowing what Norman was capable of while being unable to warn anyone or take any action that would not require revealing his own secret, managing the knowledge of a man's capacity for evil in silence, hoping that the amnesia held while also understanding, at some level beneath the hope, that things which have happened once tend to have a way of happening again. The wall had been breached. The fact of the breach did not disappear because the memory of it had been chemically altered in one person's mind. The vulnerability was real, and it was permanent, and it sat in Peter's awareness like a fault line beneath a city, invisible most of the time, easily forgotten during the ordinary business of daily life, but always there, always potentially consequential, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to become an event rather than merely a fact. He carried this knowledge back into his friendship with Harry, back into the growing warmth of his connection with Gwen, back into the daily work of being a student and a photographer and a hero, and he carried it the way he carried everything that could not be shared, quietly, internally, as another weight added to the existing structure of what he managed alone. Harry remained his friend, and Norman remained Harry's father, and the house on Ingram Street remained the house on Ingram Street, and the world continued to proceed as the world does, indifferent to the fault lines running beneath it. Waiting among all the people who moved through Peter Parker's life during his college years, and there were many, friends and enemies and the complicated figures who occupied the territory between those categories, Captain George Stacy occupied a position that was singular in a way that takes some careful attention to fully appreciate. He was not family in any formal sense. He was not a colleague or a mentor in any institutional sense. He was, in the most precise description available, the father of the woman Peter was falling in love with, and a police officer whose professional domain overlapped significantly with the activities of Peter's heroic alter ego, and a man of such evident integrity and perceptiveness that his opinion of Spider-Man carried a weight that no other civilian's opinion quite matched. But none of these descriptions, accurate as they are, fully captures what Captain Stacy meant to Peter, or why his presence in Peter's life during this period was something genuinely nourishing, in a way that went beyond the categories available for describing it. The most honest way to say it is this: George Stacy was, in certain important respects, the closest thing to Uncle Ben that Peter had encountered since Ben's death, and the recognition of this similarity, felt rather than thought, arrived in Peter's awareness gradually, and produced in him a response that was simultaneously grateful and frightened, because by this point in his life, he had developed a sufficient understanding of his own patterns to know that the people who occupied that specific position in his emotional world were also the people whose loss he was least equipped to survive. He did not think about this consciously. He simply felt in Stacy's presence a warmth and a safety that he associated with the house on Ingram Street and with the sound of Ben's voice, and he responded to that warmth with the openness that he was rarely able to sustain with anyone else, and somewhere beneath the openness was a vigilance he could not quite suppress, a monitoring of the situation for the signs of impermanence that he had come to expect from everything that felt this good. George Stacy's qualities were not showy. They expressed themselves in the same quiet, consistent register that Uncle Ben's had, in the choices he made when no one was evaluating them, in the way he treated people whose circumstances gave them no power to reward him for his consideration, in the specific quality of his listening, which was the listening of someone who actually wanted to understand rather than someone performing the social form of attention. He was a man who had spent decades watching how the city worked at its most unguarded moments, who had seen human nature under pressures that most people never encountered, and who had emerged from this exposure not cynical but more carefully, specifically compassionate. His understanding of human weakness made more generous by his direct knowledge of the circumstances that produced it. He was not naive about the world. He was clear-eyed about it in ways that made his fundamental decency all the more substantial, because it was the decency of someone who had considered the alternatives and chosen otherwise. His views on Spider-Man had been formed through the same combination of professional observation and personal judgment that informed all his views, and they were notably different from the prevailing narrative that Jonah Jameson was working so hard to establish in the public mind. Stacy had watched Spider-Man operate for long enough to recognize the difference between recklessness and controlled risk-taking, between vigilantism and genuine moral commitment, between the behavior of someone seeking personal glory and the behavior of someone who had accepted an obligation that they took seriously enough to keep paying even when the payment was steep. He could not have said, at this point, who Spider-Man was. But he had formed a clear view of what Spider-Man was, and that view was one of respect tempered by the professional's awareness that even the most well-intentioned actors in complex situations could create consequences they did not intend. Peter became aware of Captain Stacy's perspective on Spider-Man gradually, through Gwen's accounts of her father's thinking, and through the occasional direct conversations that the growing seriousness of his relationship with Gwen made natural. These conversations required Peter to navigate a particular delicacy, responding to analysis of Spider-Man's methods and motivations from the position of someone who was Spider-Man, unable to confirm or deny or offer the insider perspective that would have been most relevant, limited to reacting as Peter Parker would react, which meant with somewhat more informed interest than the average civilian, but with no more apparent personal investment than that framing could plausibly contain. He was always slightly more present in these conversations than he could fully account for, and Stacy noticed this, as Stacy noticed most things, and filed it as information whose implications he did not yet fully understand. The relationship between Peter and Gwen deepened through this period with the steady, unhurried quality of something that both people could feel was real and was going somewhere. Even when the specific destination remained undetermined, Gwen was patient with the things about Peter she couldn't explain, not because she was incurious, but because she'd come to trust that the person she was coming to know was fundamentally honest in the ways that mattered most, even if the practical details of his life contained gaps she couldn't account for. She did not require complete transparency as a condition of her growing love. She required genuine presence, and genuine presence was the thing Peter found himself most able to give her. Perhaps because her quality of attention made it easier to be present than to manage the careful performance of partiality that his relationships usually required. With Gwen, full presence felt more natural than strategic self-presentation. This was both the best thing about their relationship and the thing that made its eventual destruction most devastating. The dynamic between Peter and Captain Stacy shifted into something more explicitly significant during a conversation that took place in the Stacy family's apartment, in the living room where George's books and professional commendations occupied the same shelves, in the comfortable democracy of a home where both intellectual life and public service were valued without ceremony. The conversation had begun as an extension of a family dinner, drifting into territory that both men found genuinely engaging: the ethics of law enforcement, the limits of institutional authority, the question of what obligations exceptional individuals had toward communities that had not consented to their protection. Peter navigated this conversation with the careful awareness of someone who had personal stakes in every position being discussed, offering views that were his genuine views but that he was attributing to a general philosophical interest rather than to direct experience. Stacy listened to him with the specific quality of attention he brought to things he found worth thinking about, and at the end offered a summary of Peter's position that was more precise and more sympathetic than Peter had managed himself, and looked at him with an expression that contained something that Peter could not quite interpret and did not entirely want to examine. The protection that Peter extended to his relationship with the Stacy family was more than the standard vigilance he maintained around everyone he cared about. It had an additional layer, shaped by the specific fear that the qualities that made George Stacy valuable to him, the perceptiveness, the analytical intelligence, the professional understanding of how things worked in the world that Spider-Man moved through, were also the qualities most likely to bring him into proximity with the dangers that Spider-Man's world generated. A less observant man would have been less at risk. A man with less integrity, less professional engagement with the city's criminal landscape, would have had less occasion to be in the situations where the Goblin's orbit and Spider-Man's orbit intersected. The very qualities that Peter most admired in Captain Stacy were also the qualities that most exposed him to the specific category of danger that Peter could not protect him from without revealing the secret that made the protection possible. He thought about this. He thought about it the way he thought about all the structural problems in his life, with the methodical attention of a scientific mind applied to a problem that did not yield to scientific methods, turning it over, examining its edges, looking for the solution that the constraints of his situation would allow. There was no solution. The constraint was the secret, and the secret was not negotiable, and so the risk was not manageable beyond the general effort to keep the most dangerous aspects of his heroic life from spilling into the spaces where the people he loved were present. He did his best. He was always doing his best. His best was, in this case, as in many cases, not quite sufficient to prevent what the situation was moving toward, though it would take time for this insufficiency to become an event rather than merely a condition. Dr. Octopus as an adversary represented something different from the Green Goblin, and understanding the difference matters for understanding what happened on the construction site. Norman Osborn's hatred for Spider-Man was personal from its earliest manifestation, driven by the psychological dynamics of a man who needed dominance and found its absence intolerable. Otto Octavius's hostility was initially more impersonal, the resentment of a man of extraordinary intelligence who had been humiliated by someone he considered his inferior, and who had the specific arrogance of the pure scientist who believes that intellect is the only quality that should determine hierarchy, and is therefore perpetually enraged by the ways in which the world fails to organize itself according to this principle. The mechanical arms that the laboratory accident had fused to his nervous system were not just weapons. They were extensions of a mind that had concluded it no longer needed to operate within the social contracts that governed lesser beings. Each of his 4 additional limbs represented a different application of the intelligence he believed made him superior to anyone he encountered, and he wielded them with the cold efficiency of someone who had decided that efficiency was the highest virtue. The conflict that brought Spider-Man and Dr. Octopus into confrontation on the partially completed construction site in Manhattan was not, on its surface, connected to Peter Parker's personal life or to the people he was trying to protect. It was a situation generated by Octavius's ongoing campaign of criminal activity and Spider-Man's obligation to respond to it, one of the dozens of encounters that made up the working substance of Peter's heroic career, distinguishable from the others primarily by its setting and by the specific tactical challenges that the industrial environment created. The height of the structure, the presence of heavy machinery, the civilian workers who had not yet been fully evacuated, the exposed steel and concrete of a building in the process of becoming itself, all of these factors shaped the encounter in ways that were primarily logistical until the moment when they became something else entirely. Captain Stacy was present because he was always present when the situation was significant enough to require senior police coordination, because his professionalism did not allow him to direct operations from a safe distance when he could be more useful at the scene, and because the particular quality of his courage was the kind that expressed itself not through dramatic gesture, but through steady, consistent engagement with whatever the situation required. He had arrived with a police contingent that was attempting to manage the perimeter and coordinate with Spider-Man's efforts to contain Octavius, and he was doing what he did, observing, assessing, making decisions based on what he saw, when the section of scaffolding gave way above the crowd of spectators that had gathered at the construction site's edge. Despite the police's efforts to keep them back, the child was perhaps 4 years old, perhaps 5, standing in the crowd with the oblivious confidence of very young children who have not yet developed the survival instinct that would eventually teach them to be frightened of falling things. The section of concrete and steel that broke free from the scaffold above was not enormous but was large enough, moving fast enough, to be fatal to something small and fragile standing in its path. The calculation required no time because it was not a calculation. It was a response. The kind of response that people of genuine moral seriousness produce without deliberation, because deliberation is not what the situation allows. George Stacy moved, and the child was not where the concrete landed, and George Stacy was. The sound of it reached Peter through the noise of the ongoing confrontation with Octavius, transmitted through the spider sense as something categorically different from the combat information it had been processing. Not a threat to himself, but an outcome. A thing that had already happened, irreversible in the way that certain events are irreversible from the first moment of their occurrence. He disengaged from Octavius with a speed that surprised the villain and webbed him securely enough to buy the time needed, and then he was at Stacy's side, and the assessment he made in the first seconds was the assessment of someone who had seen enough injury to read it accurately, and what it told him was not what he wanted it to tell him. Captain Stacy was conscious. This was the thing that made what followed both more bearable and more unbearable than it might otherwise have been, that there were words available, that the ending had not arrived before the conversation could happen. He lay in Peter's arms with the particular stillness of someone conserving what remains, his breathing careful and measured in the way that breathing becomes deliberate when the body is managing something it knows is serious. The noise of the city continued around them, the distant sounds of police radios, the voices of the crowd, the ordinary background sounds of a city that does not pause for individual tragedies, and within this noise the space between Peter and George Stacy had the quality of a room with a door closed, a separate place where something important was being said that did not require the world's attention. Stacy looked at him. Not at the mask, but at him, with the directness of someone who had always seen more clearly than the available information should have allowed, and he said Peter's name, not Spider-Man. Peter. He said it quietly and without drama, as a simple acknowledgement of a fact he had held for some time and had decided there was no longer any reason to leave unspoken. He said he had known for a while. He said it the way people say things they have been waiting to say, with the relief of something released rather than the excitement of something revealed. He had known, or had known in the specific way that professional intelligence and long personal observation combined to produce certainty in the absence of confirmation, and he had kept this knowledge to himself with the discretion of someone who understood what the knowing would cost if it reached the wrong ears. What he asked for, in the time that remained to him, was simple and was devastating in its simplicity. He asked Peter to take care of Gwen. He asked it the way that people ask for things when they understand they are asking from a position that will not be available much longer, directly, without preamble, without the social softening that would have been appropriate in any other circumstance. And Peter, holding the man who had just named him by his real name from behind the mask, said yes, in the way that a person says yes when they are making a promise they intend with their entire being to keep, and when they are also, simultaneously, being broken by the weight of the circumstances in which the promise is being made. Captain Stacey died before the ambulance reached the hospital. The official reports noted the circumstances of his death with the procedural language that official reports use to contain the things that procedural language cannot fully contain. The word hero, appearing in several of them, applied accurately and inadequately to a man whose heroism had expressed itself primarily not in a single dramatic act, but in the lifelong practice of doing his job with integrity in a city that was frequently indifferent to integrity and occasionally hostile to it. The newspapers covered the story with the attention appropriate to the death of a respected senior officer, and J. Jonah Jameson's editorial contribution to the coverage managed, with the consistency that made him either admirable or infuriating depending on one's perspective, to connect Spider-Man's presence at the scene to the tragic outcome in ways that were not entirely dishonest, but were not entirely honest either, emphasizing the chaos of superhero confrontations and their costs to the innocent bystanders who were present in their vicinity. Gwen's grief was the kind that reorganizes the person who feels it, that does not simply occupy an existing emotional space but creates new topography, changing the landscape of the interior life in ways that persist long after the acute phase has passed. She had loved her father with the specific completeness of a daughter who had found in her parent an actual person, as well as a parent, someone she respected and enjoyed, and would have sought out as a friend even had the accident of birth not made the relationship compulsory. His death left a hole in her daily life that was not abstract. It was present at every meal, at every conversation she might have had with him, at every moment when she wanted to share something, and the person she most wanted to share it with was no longer available to receive it. And Spider-Man, in the narrative that assembled itself from the official accounts and the media coverage, and the understandable human need to locate agency in tragic events, was the figure at whose feet a significant portion of the responsibility for this grief could be placed. Not because the reasoning was precisely accurate, but because the reasoning was emotionally coherent in the way that grief requires, because someone had to bear the weight of what had happened, and the masked figure who had been present, whose activities had generated the confrontation that produced the conditions that led to the tragedy, was a more manageable recipient for that weight than the random cruelty of an afternoon in which a section of scaffolding gave way above a crowd, and a good man decided that his life was worth less than a child's. Peter absorbed this. He absorbed Gwen's anger at Spider-Man and the public narrative that supported it, and the specific, excruciating position of being the person she most wanted to comfort her, and the person she most wanted to blame simultaneously. He kept his promise. He was there. He was Peter Parker, her friend, her partner in the early stages of a love that had been building through a college year of shared mornings and arguments about ideas, and the gradual accumulation of mutual recognition. He held what he could hold, and withheld what he had to withhold and understood, with perfect clarity and without the relief of being able to say it to anyone that Captain George Stacey had given him, in the last moments of his life, both a gift and a task, and that the task was going to be harder than the gift was beautiful, and that this was simply how things went for Peter Parker, and that he was going to find a way to honour it anyway. Because that was the only response he had ever been able to make to the love and loss and responsibility that had defined his life since before a spider had ever crossed his path. The months that followed Captain Stacey's death moved through Peter Parker's life with the quality of weather that has settled in for a long stay. Not dramatically stormy, not the kind of crisis that announces itself and demands immediate response, but a persistent grey that altered the light through which everything else was seen, and that required each morning a deliberate choice to continue moving through the day as though the grey were manageable. Gwen was grieving in the way that the loss of a parent produces grief, which is to say thoroughly and without schedule. The acute pain of the early weeks giving way not to recovery, but to a reorganized daily existence in which the absence was woven into the texture of ordinary moments rather than concentrated into identifiable episodes of sorrow. She was not the same person she'd been before her father died, and she was not trying to be, and Peter, who understood better than most what it meant to carry a loss that had permanently altered your understanding of the world's structure, recognized this and honored it and tried to be present for it in the ways that his circumstances allowed. The ways his circumstances allowed were, as always, incomplete. He could be Peter Parker for her, the friend, the partner, the person who had known and respected her father and who shared some portion of her grief in ways she could see and respond to. He could not. She was too. The love they had been building through the year before her father's death was genuine and was not dismantled by the grief that followed, but it was strained by the way grief works on existing relationships, requiring more than they were previously required to provide, exposing the limits of what they could sustain, making visible the places where the foundation was less complete than it had appeared during easier times. Peter's inability to be fully honest with her was more costly now than it had been when their relationship was lighter, and Gwen's growing awareness that there were significant dimensions of his life she could not access created a background frustration that she expressed, when she expressed it at all, as worry rather than accusation, because she did not want to be unfair to someone who was clearly trying, and because she did not have a clear enough picture of what was missing to know precisely what she was asking for. The decision to spend time in London was her own. All arrived at through the recognition that New York, in its current configuration, was not a place where healing felt possible. The city was saturated with her father, his precincts, his favourite coffee shops, the streets he had walked on his way to work for decades, and the saturation was not comforting in the way that being surrounded by someone's memory can sometimes be comforting. It was raw. It was the constant low-level experience of almost seeing someone and then not seeing them, of the city performing the ordinary business of its existence without any acknowledgement of the specific absence it now contained. London offered distance, and distance offered, if not healing exactly, then at least the possibility of a context in which the grief was not constantly being refreshed by environmental triggers. She asked Peter if he understood. He said he did. He was telling the truth. The period of Gwen's absence was one of the lonelier passages of Peter's life, which was saying something given the general architecture of his daily experience. The relationship that had been providing him with the closest thing to genuine intimacy that his circumstances permitted was now operating at a physical remove that made even the partial connection previously available largely inaccessible, and the space this left in his daily life was filled, as empty spaces in Peter Parker's life tended to be filled, with more work, more patrols, more photographs, more hours in the ESU laboratories, more of the methodical application of his intelligence and his energy to the task that his life had assigned him, in the hope that sufficiency of effort might constitute a kind of substitute for the things the effort was displacing. It was during this period of Gwen's absence that Norman Osborn's amnesia finally, inevitably, began to fail. The process was not sudden. It was, in keeping with the way that suppressed things tend to return, gradual, a matter of increasing pressure against a barrier that had never been fully solid. Cracks appearing first as inexplicable emotional responses and then as fragmented images whose origins Norman could not account for, and then as longer sequences of memory that arrived in the small hours of sleepless nights with the quality of things that had been there all along, waiting for the conditions that would allow them to surface. The face of Spider-Man, the feeling of the glider beneath him, the specific electric satisfaction of operating without the constraints that ordinary moral life imposed. These things returned to him not as foreign elements being reintroduced, but as familiar things being uncovered, recognized as always having been present beneath the altered surface of his post-amnesia identity. Harry's deterioration provided both context and catalyst for the return of his father's darker self. The substance abuse that had troubled Harry through his college years had not resolved with time, but had intensified. Following the pattern that untreated psychological pain and chemical dependency together produce, the substances providing temporary relief from the pain, and the pain requiring increasing quantities of substance to stay temporarily at bay. Norman watched his son's decline with a mixture of genuine anguish and the specific frustration of a man who had built an empire through the force of his will and could not understand why the same force of will was not available to his son as a tool for self-correction. His love for Harry was real and was insufficient, and the insufficiency was, in the way of all parental insufficiencies that have deep structural causes, not something he could simply decide to remedy by wanting to remedy it more intensely. The return of his memories reorganized Norman's understanding of his son's problems in ways that confirmed and amplified his existing tendencies toward paranoid pattern recognition. Peter Parker's presence in Harry's life was recast in the light of recovered knowledge as something more sinister than innocent friendship. The enemy's agent maintaining proximity to his family under the cover of college companionship, the masked antagonist who had humiliated him now having access to his home, his son, his household, the personal dimensions of his existence that he had spent his professional life working to protect from intrusion. This was not a rational interpretation of Peter's friendship with Harry, but Norman Osborn, in the process of recovering his Green Goblin identity, was not operating in the register of rational interpretation, and the convergence of his love for his damaged son with his rage at the person, his recovering memory identified as his greatest enemy, produced something that was, in its own internal logic, completely coherent and completely lethal. The preparation that preceded the bridge was characteristically thorough. Norman had always been a man who planned, and the Green Goblin's plans had always been distinguished from the plans of lesser criminal minds by the depth of their psychological sophistication, the understanding that the most effective attack was not the one that caused the most physical damage, but the one that struck at the specific vulnerability that would produce the most comprehensive collapse. He had studied Peter long enough to understand what Gwen meant to him. He had watched the relationship develop through the period before his amnesia, and had access to everything his recovering memory could reconstruct about the emotional weight that Peter placed on the people closest to him. He understood that Gwen was not simply a person Peter cared about, but a specific kind of hope. The hope that happiness of a particular quality was available to him, that the future he had been unable to fully believe in since Uncle Ben's death might be real, and might be his. To take Gwen was to take that hope. This was the calculation. It was precise, and it was cruel, and it was the work of an intelligence that had decided the removal of all moral constraint was not a corruption of its capabilities, but an enhancement of them. Gwen had returned from London carrying the benefit of distance and the limitations of return, the grief no less present than when she left, but more processed, more organised into the ongoing structure of her life rather than dominating its surface. She and Peter had resumed their relationship with the particular tenderness of people who have been separated and have discovered through the separation that the connection between them matters more than the complications surrounding it. There was a quality of renewed intention between them, a conscious choice being made on both sides to commit more fully to what they were building, to allow the relationship the weight and seriousness it deserved, rather than treating it as one concern among the many competing concerns of their complicated lives. Peter had allowed himself, in the weeks since her return, to feel something approximating hope, which was, for him, always a slightly vertiginous experience, like standing at a height that offered a wonderful view but required you to be close enough to the edge to make the wonder and the danger inseparable. He was feeling this hope on the evening the goblin took her. The specifics of how it happened belong to the category of things that do not benefit from extended description. They were sudden, and they were violent, and they were over before Peter's spider sense had finished translating its alarm into conscious awareness, the goblin's speed and tactical preparation allowing him to act before the normal sequence of warning and response could complete itself. What Peter registered first was the spider sense, screaming with the specific frequency that meant someone he loved was in immediate danger, and then the sound of the goblin's laughter from somewhere above him, and then the sight of Gwen, unconscious, held in the goblin's grip against the dark sky above the bridge with the city spread out below them in all its ordinary indifferent brilliance. The George Washington Bridge. The structure that evening had the quality that large engineering achievements have at night. Not romantic exactly, but impressive in the way that things built to span what cannot otherwise be crossed are impressive. The steel cables rising from the roadway to the towers in the darkness, the river moving far below, the lights of the city reflected in fragments on the water's surface. Peter registered none of this as beauty. He registered it as geometry, the height, the distances, the positions of the goblin and Gwen relative to the bridge structure, the angles available to his web shooters, the time his reflexes would need, the variables that the situation contained and the variables he could control and the variables that were beyond any control available to him. The goblin talked. He had always talked. It was part of the psychology of the thing, the need to establish the intellectual framework within which the violence was occurring. To ensure that the opponent understood not just what was happening, but why, and specifically why the happening was an expression of the goblin's superiority rather than mere destructive capacity. The taunts were carefully constructed, drawing on the recovered memories of Norman's knowledge of Peter's identity, referencing things that only someone with access to Peter's private life could have known, designed to produce in Peter the specific quality of rattled, emotionally destabilized response that would reduce his effectiveness as an opponent. Some of them landed. The goblin understood people well enough to know which specific words would find the specific vulnerabilities he was targeting, and Peter, for all his experience and all his hard-won understanding of the psychological dimensions of his adversarial relationships, could not entirely prevent the words from doing what they were designed to do. He maintained the conversation because maintaining it was what the situation required. The goblin talking meant the goblin was not yet doing anything irreversible, and the not yet was what Peter needed. The time to assess and position and find the angle from which the situation could be resolved without the irreversible occurring. His web shooters were ready. His spider sense was mapping the space continuously, tracking the goblin's movements and Gwen's position, and the structural elements of the bridge and the wind coming off the river, and the dozen other variables that any physical intervention would need to account for. He was doing everything that his training and his experience and the full extent of his capabilities made available to him. The goblin released her without warning. This is the part of the story that requires the most care in the telling, because it has been told many times in ways that emphasize its dramatic qualities at the expense of its human ones. And because the human dimensions of it are the ones that matter most for understanding what it meant and what it cost. Gwen fell. She was unconscious, and she fell, and the river was very far below, and the web line left Peter's shooter in the fraction of a second that his enhanced reflexes made available, and it caught her, and the catching was real, and the catching was something, and the catching was not enough. The physics of it have been analysed and debated in the years since, by people who were not present, and who bring to the analysis the comfortable distance of retrospection. The speed of the fall, the length of the line, the deceleration required, the specific fragility of the human body when subjected to forces that exceed what it was designed to sustain. These are the variables that the analysis addresses, and the analysis produces conclusions that are, in their own terms, accurate. What the analysis cannot fully address is the quality of the moment itself, which was not a physics problem but a human one, and which was experienced not in the language of vectors and deceleration, but in the language of a hand reaching for something it almost reached, of a line that was both everything and not quite enough, of a sound that arrived in the fraction of a second before understanding did, and that Peter Parker would hear in the quiet spaces of his own mind for the rest of his life. He brought her to the bridge. He held her. He understood, in the way that certain understandings arrive fully formed and irrevocable, what had happened. The goblin was still present, still talking, the laughter continuing because the laughter was the point and the point had been made, and Peter heard it from the same great distance from which he had heard the police officer's voice on the staircase of the house on Ingram Street on a Thursday evening in November years before, the distance that shock creates between the event and the person it is happening to, the protective interval that reality provides before the full weight of what has occurred is allowed to settle. He set her down gently. He stood up slowly. The rage that moved through him in the moments that followed was unlike anything he had previously experienced, different in quality from the anger that had sent him into the streets after Uncle Ben's burglar, different from the cold fury of his most difficult battles, different from every previous version of his own capacity for anger that he had encountered and managed. It was total. It was the rage of someone who had spent his entire conscious life paying every price that was asked of him, honouring every obligation, accepting every limitation, doing the right thing again and again at costs that accumulated past any reasonable accounting, and who had in one moment lost the thing that all of that paying had been silently, unconsciously protecting, the belief, held beneath everything else, that it was going to be worth it, that the life he was living in service of others was going to eventually be permitted to contain something that was purely and simply his. He fought the goblin across the bridge with everything he had, and everything he had was considerable, and it expressed itself in those minutes without the calibration and the careful modulation that normally governed the application of his strength. The goblin, who had wanted to see Spider-Man broken, discovered that what he'd produced instead was something he was less well equipped to manage. Not a broken opponent, but an opponent who had temporarily and completely stopped calculating the acceptable limits of the response. He had miscalculated. He had understood Peter's love for Gwen as a vulnerability. He had not fully understood that for someone who had been protecting himself from the full weight of hope for as long as Peter had, the collapse of that protection did not produce paralysis, but its opposite. The Green Goblin's death, when it came from his own machinery. The glider that had been the instrument of so much of his violence turning against him in the final exchange, the weapon becoming the wound in the way that the weapons of people whose violence is ultimately an expression of their own psychology sometimes do. Peter did not deliver the killing blow. This is a fact that mattered enormously to him in the aftermath, that he had not, in the end, crossed the line that the enormity of what had happened had brought him very close to crossing. He had been close. He had been close enough to feel the territory on the other side of that line, to know what it would feel like to stop pulling back, and the knowledge of his own proximity to that territory was something he would add to the long inventory of things he carried without being able to set down. He went back to Gwen. He sat with her for a long time, there on the bridge, in the noise of the city continuing around him, and he held the grief that was beginning to arrive in the specific way that grief arrives when the shock has done what it can, and the reality is left to be faced without mediation. The night was cold, and the river was still far below, and the cables of the bridge rose above him into the dark, and somewhere in the city, Aunt May was asleep in the house on Ingram Street, and Harry Osborn's life was about to collapse in a completely different direction, and everything was about to become different in ways that he could not yet predict. What he knew, sitting there, was the confirmation of the belief he had carried since the warehouse, since the sound of Aunt May's voice changing on the telephone, since the first morning he had understood what his uncle's absence meant, and what his own role in it had been. He had been right. He had always been right about this one terrible thing. Happiness was not something the universe had designed his life to contain. Love arrived and was real and was taken, and the taking was not random but was connected, in ways he could not fully articulate but could not stop feeling. To the specific nature of who he was and what it meant to be both those things simultaneously. The spider had bitten him, and the bite had given him powers that he had tried to use well, and the price of using them well was this. Always this, eventually, in one form or another. He was 22 years old, and he was sitting on the George Washington Bridge, and the woman he loved was gone, and the city was still there, and it still needed him, and he was still going to answer when it called, because that was the only response he had ever been able to make to the things that happened to him, and because answering was the only way he knew to honour the people whose absence he was always, in every moment of every patrol, simultaneously carrying and trying to justify. He stood up. He picked up his web shooter, which had come loose in the fighting, and he reattached it to his wrist, and he looked out at the city for a long moment, and then he swung away through the dark. Because there was nowhere else to go and nothing else to do, and because Peter Parker had never, not once in his life, been able to choose the alternative, there is a specific quality to victory that arrives too late, and it is nothing like victory at all. It occupies the same physical space that triumph should occupy. The moment after the battle ends, the moment when the threat has been neutralized, and the immediate danger has passed and the city can resume its ordinary business. But it is filled with something entirely different, something that has no clean name, but that everyone who has ever won something at too great a cost recognizes immediately and viscerally. It is the feeling of having been precisely right in every tactical sense, and catastrophically wrong in every sense that actually matters. Peter Parker knew this feeling intimately by the time he swung away from the bridge, and the knowing of it did not diminish with distance or with time, or with the application of the considerable intelligence he brought to every other problem his life presented. It simply settled in alongside everything else he carried, adding its specific weight to the existing structure, becoming part of the permanent landscape of what it felt like to be him. The Green Goblin was gone. Norman Osborn was dead, impaled by the same glider that had carried him through years of violence and megalomania, the machinery of his cruelty becoming, in the end, the instrument of his undoing, in the way of things whose internal logic eventually catches up with them. The fact of his death provided Peter with nothing that could reasonably be called relief, because relief requires the removal of a burden, and the burden that Norman Osborn's campaign had produced was not removed by Norman Osborn's death. It was permanent. It was the shape of Gwen's absence in the daily texture of the world. The specific silence where her voice would have been, the missing weight of her presence in every space she had previously occupied. Norman could die 100 times, and none of the dying would address that absence, because the absence was not a problem that solutions could reach. It was simply a fact now, installed in the architecture of Peter's life with the same finality as Uncle Ben's death, as permanent and as unaddressable and as thoroughly his to carry. He found his way home in the hours before dawn, moving through the city with the automatic efficiency of someone whose body knows the route well enough to navigate it without conscious direction, the mind engaged elsewhere, processing things that did not yield to processing. The streets of the city were quiet at that hour, with the particular quiet of a place that has temporarily suspended its daytime performance and is simply existing. Buildings and pavement and streetlights maintaining their positions without the human activity that normally defines their function. Peter moved through this quiet and felt, beneath the grief and beneath the rage that had spent itself against the Green Goblin and left him hollow, something that he did not immediately identify because it was too familiar to register as a distinct experience. It was the loneliness of the secret, the ache of having moved through an enormous and permanently altering experience without a single person who knew the full story of what had happened and what it meant and why it had cost what it had cost. He had no one to tell. He had never had anyone to tell. The condition was not new. But grief has a way of making familiar conditions freshly visible, stripping away the habituation that normally allows us to move through our circumstances without fully feeling them. And in the hours after the bridge, Peter felt his aloneness with an acuity that the habituation of years had previously softened. Aunt May was asleep when he came in, the house quiet, with the specific quiet of a place where someone is sleeping, and the sleeping has organized the air into something peaceful and slightly sacred. He sat in the kitchen for a long time without turning on the lights, in the dark that was not quite dark because the streetlight outside the kitchen window provided a pale, indirect illumination that was enough to see by without being enough to feel fully present in the ordinary world. He sat and he breathed and he let the night proceed around him, and he did not try to think his way through what had happened, because thinking was not adequate to it, and he knew this, and he honoured the inadequacy by simply being still. The question of how he had come so close to killing the Green Goblin was one he would return to many times in the following weeks, not as an accusation against himself, but as a genuine inquiry into the territory of his own character that the evening had revealed. He had been, on the bridge, in the presence of his own capacity for violence, in a way that went beyond anything his previous encounters with dangerous enemies had produced. The rage had been real, and it had been enormous, and it had found expression in the fighting in ways that he was not proud of, and could not simply dismiss as understandable given the circumstances, because the whole point of the moral framework that Uncle Ben's death had installed in him was that circumstances did not determine ethics, that the rightness or wrongness of an action was not a function of how much provocation had preceded it. He had nearly killed a man. The man had deserved, by any ordinary accounting, consequences far more severe than most people who had ever faced Peter Parker's anger. And none of that made what Peter had nearly done acceptable, and he knew it, and the knowing of it added its own specific layer to the grief he was already managing. This was the particular shape of Peter Parker's moral life, not the simple heroism of someone who always did the right thing, but the more complicated heroism of someone who sometimes nearly did not, and who held himself to account for the nearness with the same rigour that he would have applied to an actual transgression. The standard he maintained was demanding beyond what most people would consider reasonable or healthy, and the demanding of it was both his greatest strength and one of the mechanisms by which he kept the belief that he did not deserve happiness functioning and current. Every near failure was evidence. Every moment when the darkness in him had been visible, even if not acted upon, was data that confirmed the verdict he had never consciously articulated, but had always, at some level, accepted. Harry Osborn received the news of his father's death in a condition that was not well suited to receiving it. The substance abuse that had been worsening through his college years had reached a stage where his capacity for processing difficult emotional information was significantly compromised. His nervous system already strained to a point that made the ordinary management of daily life difficult, let alone the management of grief at the sudden, violent death of a parent. What Harry knew, or what he was told, was that his father had died in a confrontation involving Spider-Man, that the masked hero had been present at the scene, had apparently been engaged in fighting with his father, and that the outcome of this fighting had been Norman Osborn's death. The full context of what had actually occurred, who his father had been and what he had been doing and why the confrontation had taken place and what had been at stake, was information that Harry did not have and that Peter could not give him. The grief that Harry produced in response to his father's death was the grief of someone whose relationship with the person lost had been unfinished and unresolved in the specific, painful way that relationships between emotionally unavailable parents and their children often are, full of things unsaid, reconciliations not quite achieved, the persistent hope of eventual understanding that death makes permanently unavailable. Harry had wanted something from his father that Norman had never been able to provide, and Norman's death meant the wanting would never be resolved. And grief combined with thwarted longing produces a particularly corrosive mixture of emotions that, in Harry's already vulnerable state, expressed itself with increasing volatility as the weeks after the funeral proceeded. The direction in which Harry's grief turned was towards Spider-Man, and this was, from Peter's perspective, among the more agonizing developments that the aftermath of the bridge produced. Harry did not know that his best friend was the person his grief had identified as responsible for his father's death. He knew only that Spider-Man had been there, and that his father was gone, and that the masked figure who had been celebrated by some and condemned by others as New York's resident vigilante had been in some way connected to the worst event of Harry's life. The anger was understandable. It was also, from Peter's position, impossible to address, impossible to correct, impossible to hold with any of the responses that a person normally has available when a friend's grief is directed at something that can be clarified or corrected. He sat with Harry through the worst of it, and heard the anger, and absorbed it without defence, and carried the specific weight of knowing that the anger was not entirely wrong, even if its target was not fully accurate. Even if the full picture of what had happened would have reorganised Harry's understanding in ways that might have redirected at least some of the blame, he told Harry he was sorry. He said it repeatedly, in different contexts, in response to different expressions of the grief and the anger, and he meant it each time with the full sincerity of someone for whom the word carried considerably more freight than the social form of condolence it was also performing. He was sorry in ways that Harry could hear, and in ways that Harry could not, and the gap between the visible apology and the invisible one was another version of the fundamental gap that structured all of Peter's most important relationships, the truth always slightly larger than what the circumstances allowed him to express. Aunt May's response to Gwen's death was offered with the full warmth of a woman who had watched her nephew fall in love for the first time with someone she considered genuinely worthy of him, and who understood, as much as someone without the full picture could understand, the scale of what he had lost. She made tea and she sat with him, and she said the things that people say when someone they love has lost someone. And the things she said were not inadequate in the way that words sometimes feel inadequate to grief, but were instead simply themselves, honest and warm and limited in the ways that all human comfort is limited by the impossibility of actually taking away another person's pain. She had lost Ben. She knew something about the specific quality of losing a person who had organised your understanding of the future around their continued presence. She did not try to minimise what Peter was feeling or to move him through it faster than he could move. She sat with him in it, and her sitting was its own kind of comfort, the presence of someone who had survived her own version of this and was still here, still making tea, still tending the garden, still choosing each morning to continue. The public response to the events on the bridge, filtered through the inevitable distortions of media coverage and editorial agenda, proceeded in ways that Peter had learned to expect, but could not learn to be entirely indifferent to. Jonah Jameson's coverage was not, in this instance, straightforwardly hostile to Spider-Man. The complexity of the events, the involvement of the Green Goblin, the acknowledged criminality of Norman Osborn, made the usual simple narrative of Spider-Man as menace more difficult to sustain without ignoring facts that were on public record. But Jameson found, with the instinct of someone who had spent his career finding angles, ways to ensure that the coverage raised questions about Spider-Man's presence, about what had actually occurred, about whether Gwen Stacy would still be alive if Spider-Man had not been involved. The questions were framed carefully enough to avoid the specific accusation, but clearly enough to plant the specific doubt, and the doubt, once planted in enough minds, performed its usual function of persisting in the absence of clear refutation. Peter read the coverage and felt, in addition to the grief and the exhaustion, a specific kind of tired anger at the machinery of public narrative and its complete indifference to the actual experience of the person whose story it was processing into content. The Daily Bugle's coverage of the night on the bridge existed in a register so far from the reality of what that night had been, what it had felt like, what it had cost, what it had confirmed about the structure of his life, that reading it produced a kind of dissociation, the strange experience of recognizing an event as the same event that you lived through, while finding it completely unrecognizable in the form in which it was being publicly discussed. He was still providing photographs to the Bugle. He would continue to provide them. The arrangement was what it had always been, necessary, absurd, and impossible to explain to anyone without the full context that he was not in a position to provide. The weeks after the bridge had a texture that was distinct from the weeks after Uncle Ben's death, and examining the distinction reveals something important about how Peter's relationship with loss had evolved over the years between one grief and another. After Ben, the grief had been immediately and overwhelmingly organized around guilt. The recognition of his own role, the specific causal connection between his choice and the outcome, the terrible clarity of a wound that was also an accusation. After Gwen, the grief was differently shaped, not organized around a clear moment of personal failure, because Peter had not failed in any way that could be identified and corrected on the night of the bridge, had not made the wrong choice or let someone walk past when he should have stopped them. He had done everything his capabilities made available to him. He had been, by any honest assessment, a hero in the full and demanding sense of the word, and it had not been enough, and this not enough had a different quality from the not enough of the warehouse, because this one could not be addressed by doing better. It was simply the world asserting its indifference to heroism in the most direct way available. This distinction mattered because it represented in some ways the completion of a lesson that the warehouse had begun. The warehouse had taught him that failure to act had consequences. The bridge taught him that acting fully and correctly also had consequences, that the universe did not exempt even its most dedicated and conscientious heroes from the randomness and the cruelty that made heroism necessary in the first place. He was not being punished for his choices. He was not receiving a corrective for his errors. He was simply living in a world that contained the green goblin and high bridges and the specific physics of falls, and his powers were extraordinary, and his commitment was genuine, and his love for Gwen had been real, and none of it had been sufficient to keep her alive. And the insufficiency was not a moral verdict, but a physical fact, and the difference between a moral verdict and a physical fact was, at this particular depth of grief, very difficult to feel. The hollowness that the hollow victory produced in Peter settled gradually into the ongoing structure of his daily existence, taking its place beside the other permanent residents of his interior life. Uncle Ben's death, Captain Stacy's last words, the warehouse, and the security guard's face, as another of the foundational losses around which everything else was organized. He continued to be Spider-Man. He continued to sell photographs to the Bugle. He continued to check on Aunt May and to be present for Harry in the limited ways that Harry's deteriorating state allowed him to be present, and that his own grief made him capable of offering. He continued to show up to his classes at ESU and to maintain the performance of Peter Parker that the world required, the slightly distracted, perpetually tired young man whose life contained unexplained complications that he managed somehow, without completely falling apart. He was falling apart in the ways that people fall apart when the falling is distributed across time, rather than concentrated into a single visible collapse. But he was also, simultaneously, still standing, still functional, still present for the obligations that his life had assigned him. Both things were true. Both had always been simultaneously true in Peter Parker's case, the falling and the standing coexisting in the same person with the improbable persistence of someone who had decided, or who had decided for him by the specific nature of his character and his history, that continuing was not optional, regardless of the cost of continuing. He had chosen this, or it had chosen him, on a November night years before when he had come home from a warehouse and sat in the dark kitchen and understood what he was and what he was for. The city needed Spider-Man. Spider-Man was Peter Parker. Peter Parker was going to keep going. The logic was simple and it was complete, and it did not require him to be happy to function, which was, in a terrible and very specific way, entirely consistent with everything his life had been trying to tell him since before a spider had ever crossed his path. He was not meant to be happy. He had confirmed it again. He was meant to keep going, and he was going to keep going, and the grief was going to travel with him the way grief travels with people who carry it honestly. Not as a burden that grows lighter with time exactly, but as something that becomes more familiar, more integrated, more part of the fabric of who you are rather than an intrusion upon it. Gwen would be part of him now, as Ben was part of him, as Captain Stacy was part of him. The people he had loved and lost were the architecture of his interior life, the structure within which he continued to move and choose and act and, in the most limited and most honest sense of the word, live. He kept going. It was what he did. It was, in the end, the only form of tribute he knew how to offer to the people, whose absence made the going harder and also, in the way of love that outlasts its object, more necessary. And so the story rests here, in the quiet that follows a long and honest telling, in the space where words have done what words can do, and the rest belongs to something softer and less nameable than language. You have travelled a considerable distance tonight, not through battles or boroughs or the geography of a city, but through the interior landscape of a person who spent his life trying to reconcile the weight of what he could do with the impossibility of doing enough, and who kept trying anyway, morning after morning in the only way he knew. What Peter Parker carried was not so different from what all of us carry. The losses that become part of us, the love that costs more than we expected, the quiet, persistent work of believing we deserve the life we are living, even when the evidence feels uncertain. His web was made of responsibility and grief, and stubborn, renewable hope. So is yours, so is everyone's. Let that thought settle now, gentle as silk, light as the moment just before sleep arrives. You have done enough today. You have carried what you carry with more grace than you know. The city is quiet. The night is soft. Whatever remains unresolved can wait until morning, when you will be rested and present and ready and more than equal to it. Rest now. The web holds.